Chair Dickey, we're ready whenever you are.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just going to make a land acknowledgement to start off. I'd like to recognize that the area that we call the Fraser Valley Regional District has been home to Indigenous peoples for generations. There are 31 communities with reserve lands in the FERD's jurisdiction and as many as 69 groups with interests in the area. We honor our commitment to collaboration, inclusion, and reconciliation in our work here today and call to order the February 13th meeting of the Electoral Area Services Committee meeting. Ms. Kinnaman, and call the meeting to order and I think I'll turn things over to Ms. Kinnaman.
Sure, yes. So the first item on our agenda is your report from this morning's Regional and Corporate Services Committee meeting.
Okay, thank you. We had a quiet meeting this morning until we came to item 7.2, which concerned the advocacy committee meetings and their reports out as to issues that we need to look forward to in the coming year. Item 7.2 was severed on the recommendation from Director Castle. This allowed a discussion surrounding the direction to staff to further develop an advocacy plan following 14 issues in 2025. Director Castle expressed concerns that 14 issues would result in extensive work for staff and associated costs. Director Castle ventured that perhaps some of these issues could be monitored and others could take the form of minister meetings. Director Castle also expressed that he wouldn't be supportive of moving 14 issues forward due to the workload to staff. Excuse me. These issues resulted in a wide-ranging discussion with many questions. The consensus seemed to be that both board and staff should exert caution and monitor the staff demands surrounding these issues. And the resolution was passed with one person contrary, being Director Castle. And that was really the only discussion that came up during the open part of the RACS meeting. Ms. Kinnaman.
Thank you. So looking for approval of the agenda, addenda, and late items. And I will just note that staff would recommend removing item 7.2 from the agenda as the applicant is going to be making some changes to their application.
So moved.
Director Castle, second. Director Dixon, any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, contrary, motion carries.
Next is 5.1, which is the Electoral Area Flood Infrastructure Policy Update and Gap Analysis. And this afternoon, we have a presentation by Urban Systems.
Good. And this is Mr.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aaron Coelho from Urban Systems out of our accountant's office. Thanks for having me here today. Today, we're here to share with you the great work that's been done so far on the Flood Hazard Management Service Provision Policy. It's in draft, and we're really keen to get any thoughts and discussion around it so we can take the next steps towards finalizing it. So, this is very slick. Okay, so our agenda for today, we're just going to do a brief background and overview of the project and where it came from, where it's funded, and some of the kind of key considerations behind it, as well as just kind of narrowing on the scope for everyone. And we'll go over the kind of objectives and vision, and then we will move on to going into actually each part of the policy just at a high level. And we have some key questions for all of you here, and I'm sure you have some for us. So we'll spend most of our time on the discussion side of things. Okay, for a bit of background, the FERD has worked through similar projects in the past. So in 2009 and 2010, there was the Sustainable Water Service Policy and Gap Assessment, followed a couple of years later by the Sewer Policy and Gap Assessment. The sewer policy was updated a couple of years ago. And so the FERD has had a lot of success with this form of coming up with policies that really guide service delivery. And so a funding program came available that has allowed the FERD to undertake a similar assignment with respect to flood services. So that program is through UBCM. It's the Disaster Risk Reduction Climate Adaptation Program. And it funds two projects. The same funding funds two projects that we're currently working on. One is the development of this policy, and the second is the gap assessment, which is currently underway. So there are two different projects. The policy is what we're here to talk about today. And the gap assessment is looking at specific infrastructure and services and understanding what are some of the gaps to the level of service with respect to some of the things that are in this policy, and understanding what kind of project studies, capital programs would be needed for all of those infrastructure systems. And we're anticipating that to be done around June, in June. Okay, so flood protection services. This is a very high level and important topic in the province right now. Definitely for the FBRD. There's a lot of challenges around who's responsible for what, who pays for what, and there's a lot of pressure on local governments. So, we've heard from staff that we get pressure from community members wanting to understand what the services are that the FBRD provides when it comes to even small nuanced flooding issues and where that falls. We know that there's improvement districts that operate flood infrastructure in the FBRD, and the FBRD often partners with those improvement districts in order to help secure funding to make those things happen. And province-wide, a lot of improvement districts are actually in the process of dissolution, and that's happening in some ways in the FBRD as well. So understanding what's happening with that infrastructure, whether it's abandoned already or under the control of another party. So there's pressures there. Also coming from the province, the new flood strategy, the province is really looking to download some responsibility onto local governments. So there's quite a bit of pressure coming from that angle as well. So with all these things, it's kind of important to have this policy in place to really guide successful, sustainable delivery of flood services for the FBRD, both current ones and any ones that might come in the future. And so that's really the focus here. So when it comes to this flood policy, the scope is about that flood protection infrastructure and services, local service areas for that. And so it doesn't touch really on emergency management. So flood emergencies are in a different scope, not covered here, and they're covered under the emergency management program policy. Okay, so with this being built around what the FBRD currently has in terms of flood infrastructure and what we anticipate in terms of that sustainable service delivery, and really having local service areas available to actually fund and operate any type of infrastructure, we wanted to bring up like the limitation, or maybe not even limitation, but the policy is written in a way that doesn't limit innovation. And so things that are happening with the Hatzic Lake Stewardship Working Group, that's a new innovative approach to flood infrastructure governance. And we know that that's an ongoing work that's happening. And so this policy both supports that and creates flexibility for allowing those processes to happen and evolve, while also holding the line on the things that are already in place, and really creating some forms of very delineated, clear expectations for when the FBRD does get involved in this type of service. Does anybody have any questions or comments on that? Dad?
Director Castle, please.
Well, if you ask.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I had going into this was just in regards to the work that is also being done with the Hatzic Watershed Stewardship Team, and if these two projects that are kind of going simultaneously, is there an opportunity for them to speak to each other or to share information, or as we're moving forward with Hatzic, can that work guide this work or vice versa? Can you just speak to it? I'm happy that both projects are happening. I'm just wondering if there's an overlap that we can learn from and share.
Yeah, great question, Corey. For sure, in terms of the two projects speaking to each other, we do have the benefit of our colleague Aaron Lee, leading that project from our end. So we do collaborate and speak across both of them to understand, make sure there's nothing that's clashing, and in fact, ideally that they're aligned So we're definitely working towards that. And Jennifer, did you want to add anything on that?
Thank you. No, I think actually the timing is exceptional. In fact, I don't know when we started this particular project, we had envisioned that that would be the case. But I think that this is really actually a very opportune time to be having this conversation.
Yeah, for sure, Director Corey. So there is a section in the policy that we'll get to that does talk about interagency relationships and partnerships that does reflect kind of what's evolving with HATSIC as well. But it also aligns in the sense that, you know, however that ends up working out, that there's some key things in place around like acquisition, financial sustainability, resourcing that would, the principles behind this policy would still apply in that situation. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it. Yeah.
Director Davidson has a question.
Oh, perfect.
Just echoing that last comment, to me, as I read it, that strikes me as what makes, if we're looking at a FVRD kind of regional wide policy, then the sense I get is that this would be providing input into HATSIC watershed stewardship team more so than the other way around. Anyway, just my thoughts on it, but thank you.
Good, thank you. Aaron.
Good point. Thanks, Hugh. Okay, so just a quick example of when, like, because the policy is very much specific to infrastructure services, flood protection infrastructure services. Here are the examples of what currently exists in the FVRD. So there are 7 different systems, all with their own service area. And so this policy would apply to those and any services like them moving forward. Okay, so this slide is included in this graphic is in the policy, and what it's meant to show is just how the policy is both informed by and considers all of the other contexts, both in the FVRD as well as the provincial context. So you can see a lot of the provincial acts that touch on flood related infrastructure and flood management, and then of course all the FVRD policies, regulations, and bylaws that also play a role in this scope. And so those have all been reviewed and included to ensure alignment within the policy with those things. Okay, so just a quick slide on kind of an overview of like the really key considerations that went into forming the policy. We got to work pretty closely with staff to understand some of the challenges around existing services and infrastructure. And so things like sustainable funding to maintain a base level of service, that's one that came up quite a bit. Even defining what is a base level of service versus potentially an enhanced level of service. And there was a lot of discussion around that with a lot of existing infrastructure being built some time ago to the standard of the day, that would be the base level of service, would be whatever it was designed and built to. And so that is what the FVRD is maintaining that infrastructure to. And it's something that we're digging into as part of the gap assessment to understand where all the systems are at with respect to that. There's also acquisition. So again, back to that kind of pressure on the FVRD from various different places to take over and expand this flood protection services. So there's actually a large part of the policy is about acquisition and what that would look like. And what are some of the things that need to be in place for the FVRD to successfully manage and finance these types of services for the long term. There's also a piece around governance and jurisdiction that really helps the FVRD, all of you here, and even the public to understand like where does jurisdiction lie when it comes to the different land types, and who would be responsible. I think that's a question that's asked quite a bit. So there's a table in the policy that kind of outlines the FVRD's role with respect to different land types. And it's meant to help as a communication tool and be something that can be relied on in the FVRD when they do get pressure from different parties about things that might not be part of your particular service. So there's some guidance there. Okay, so before we actually dig into the vision and all the objectives, we did have a chance to speak to a couple other regional districts just to get a sense of how they're handling this type of policy, if they have one. Turns out that a lot don't. And in fact, there aren't. We talked to the TNRD and the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District, and neither of them actually have flood infrastructure services that they own and operate. And that's actually pretty uncommon. So the FDRD is unique in that sense. Whereas other regional districts, their focus was really more on emergency management. Like many regional districts, they're limited in terms of their resources. So like their role in flooding, they really, when they spoke with us about it, it was all about that kind of emergency, helping coordinate emergency response. So they helped secure funding through other agencies and help be that like contact between their constituents and other parties who are coming in to help. So that was really interesting. So relationships for them were really key as they are here. And there was an interesting, in Squamish Regional District, there is an improvement district that operates a large dike along the river. And the entire community pays into it. So it's kind of a unique scenario where the service area is large, even though like the direct protection is limited to a certain part of the community. There's a recognition that a lot of the ancillary services are also protected for other community members. So they have an agreement where it's a broader funding model. So that was just kind of an interesting take. And I think there might be some questions around, future establishment of service areas in the FDRD and what that looks like in terms of who would be in that service area, what are the direct and indirect benefits of a service, and kind of understanding that. So just kind of an interesting example.
Could you, excuse me, could you expand on this, these examples of regional districts owning and operating flood protection infrastructure, how we are different from other regional districts?
Just that the ones that we've talked to and that we're aware of, they don't actually have infrastructure that's owned and maintained by them. So I guess in that case,
so like stormwater management, we have for our subdivisions,
right.
Other regional districts wouldn't have that?
That's a good question. Don't know if we talked specifically about storm as opposed to more broader flood.
Like diking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, mostly diking. Steve, did you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen is what you've seen as well. There's a lot of diking authorities like Nikuman Island and such that are private or independent, sorry, as improvement districts that I think still exist throughout the province. And then with the drainage infrastructure, many regional districts don't have any pipe systems. So it's in their MODI, if they're ditches, then they still stick with MODI for the Ministry of Transportation for the most part. Maybe you guys have been asked to take over more than other regional districts. I don't know for sure, but in the historical times, that would of course stuck with MODI and not been something that would have been transferred to the regional district. So
Mr. Brubaker, are you saying that the regional district here has much more urbanized neighborhoods than typically is found in elsewhere?
Probably those two that we talked to. And yes, I'd say in general, you do have a lot more abutting subdivision areas that are of higher density, but we didn't talk to all of the regional districts. I'm sure that if we talked to maybe like Capital Regional District or say Nanaimo, they might have some similar circumstances that you do.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me for interrupting you.
Oh, no problem. Uh-oh. I held the button down. I'm sorry. Thanks. Okay, so before we get into maybe the details of the policy, we just wanted to go over the vision, the draft vision and objectives. So the vision, I'll read it. The FBRD supports sustainable electoral area communities by taking a holistic approach to flood hazard management. This approach enables an understanding of the existing flood hazard landscape, the achievable level of service around flood hazard management, and aims to inform land use planning decisions. The FPRD supports a collaborative approach to flood hazard management, including senior government agencies and Indigenous communities. So the vision is meant to capture that intent to where services are already established or when they are potentially acquire new services, that the FPRD has a commitment to wanting to maintain those services to at least the base level of service, unless asked to go beyond. So there's that commitment there. And then this policy really outlines what those commitments are and what those things are, that those standards are that want to be achieved. And then it also talks about, leaving that open to those partnerships that they're becoming more common and evolving as flooding and flood infrastructure affects all of us and our neighbors. And so this collective responsibility on how we can come together around some of this that might be unique, like HATSIC. So that's the policy or the vision statement. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, excuse me, Director Wardenberg.
Yeah, through the chair, to the presenter. Just on that base level, so when you say base level, what do you mean by that? To the level, you're maintaining to, what level is your base level? How do you get to the base level?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good question. So the base level of service as defined in the policy is whatever that infrastructure was designed and constructed to achieve. So that would be considered the base level, and so that's how it's defined.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Thank you. So, question: in the Chilliwack River Valley, there was a flood, thinking 10 years ago, and the provincial government gave us a grant to build a dike, Wilson Road Dike, multi-million-dollar project. But afterwards, there are only a few homes that are being protected. So how do they cover the cost of maintaining this structure?
That's a good question, and I might ask staff maybe to weigh in on that one.
Am I outside of the topic that we're addressing today?
No, I think it's good context.
I think, too, Mr. Chair, this policy is going to guide us to that level. Like, I'll give you an example of Wilson Road Dike. When it was built, it was an orphan dike, and then province came to us and said, we're going to give you $5 million to build a dike. And we just took that because we thought that's an opportunity. But then when we built it, then we realized that, this is only serving 25, 30 homes. And then how do we deal with it? So this policy is going to guide us towards that. So before we take over any money or any provincial gifts, lack of a better word, we are going to go through that process and find out whether if the service area will be economically viable, whether we should take it over and things like these. So this is where we're gonna get some help from.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Islam. Director Castle.
Thank you, Chair Dickey. I just want to go back to Director Wardenberg's question about base level of service. And I'm just wondering, so if you have a dike that was built in 1948 and to 1948 standards, and obviously the diking standards have changed. So the base level of service would be as it was constructed in 48. And through your policy, the enhanced level of service would be bringing it up to today's standards. What sort of risk does that present to the regional district, to the, like, if the base level is not, if the base level of service is not getting better, I can't find good words, but if it's not changing as the standards are changing, is this a good policy?
Good question. Yes. So like for any given piece of infrastructure that already exists that would be designed to those standards of the time, there is the option, of course, to upgrade it to today's standard, that enhanced level of service. But where that decision would come in would need to come from one, understanding like what does that look like, how much does it cost, what are the risks, and then having that conversation with those who are receiving the service. And part of that is coming through actually through our gap assessment, is just understanding where are these pieces of infrastructure and their level of service, and what would it take to get to an enhanced level. And so we're starting on putting that together yet.
And I think where I'm kind of hung up on is just this notion that the way it was built isn't acceptable to call that base,
Mm-hmm.
and that the base doesn't change as the standards change.
Mm.
So in my way of thinking, if the standard today is different, that becomes the base. If we want to go beyond the standard, that would be an enhanced. And I know over here where things are going on in our heads about some large implications to that, but from a policy perspective, not sure I've wrapped my head around base service as defined.
Aaron?
Chair
Yes.
Dickey, I see Mr. Brubaker has his hand raised.
Go
Yeah.
ahead. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. And just to clarify, so I think like when you see this picture as a resident, you have no idea what standard it's been built. Like what is the level of service? You see a dike, you assume it's a dike and you assume it's going to be protecting you. Unfortunately, as I'm sure you've experienced, I mean, you have no ability to collect additional money from these taxpayers to improve that dike unless, of course, they agree to fund that infrastructure. And so the goal with this approach, and it'll take some education, is that if you have a 1945 dike in front of your property and the electoral area residents don't agree to contributing to bringing that dike up to today's standard, we just don't want to have a sort of an expectation from folks buying homes in this area who think that, well, there's a dike there, it must be built to 2025 standards when it's a 1945 dike and it wasn't built to today's standards. So it's trying to align expectations, but there's nothing to stop any electoral area from saying, hey, service area, sorry, to improve to today's standard. It's just that it's going to be at a cost. And that's the piece that we just want to align expectations with what where money has been spent, if that makes sense.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Brubaker. And I'm guessing those costs could, in some cases, be excessive, but Director Davidson.
I would just see it as a condition of us acquiring existing infrastructure. If we're building something new, obviously it's going to be today's standards. But as I was reading the draft policy, I thought there was a lot of good language in there about addressing something where you're acquiring something that's as you say, that 1948 standard. But there's opportunities during that, I think, that acquisition process to speak to that and basically say, no, sorry, not interested, or we're gonna need the money from somewhere to bring it up to scratch before the FERD takes it on, which to me made a lot of sense. That was my interpretation of it. I'm not sure if I'm 100% on that one, but thanks.
Good, thank you, Director Davidson.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so these are the core objectives of the policy. I won't read them out, but does anybody have any questions as you review these now or from before on the specific wording and objectives?
Director Davidson.
I do have a few questions and comments. I have some notes. I'm just not sure how deeply you're going to dive into each one of these. So I can withhold my questions until then, or if we're staying high level, I can let it all hang out now.
Okay, maybe we'll just try and get an idea of timelines here. So how much time have we devoted to this presentation and how far through? And
good point. We are ready to move on to the specific sections within the policy where we do have, there's more opportunity to comment on those, Director Davidson.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe we'll leave it to that and just kind of move things along. Is that
okay? Good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll invite my colleague James over on this part.
All right. Thank you very much, Chair Dickey and board directors. My name is James Klukas. I'm a community planner with Urban Systems, and I'll be just walking us through the draft policy framework in a bit more detail. And cognizant of time, I know you've had the chance to review the policy document. I'll aim to keep it fairly high level, but stop for some discussion on a few key areas where we're seeking some input. But by all means, please feel free to keep asking questions and facilitating discussion as we go through this. So this framework that you see really reflects the key considerations that Aaron has already discussed, and you'll certainly see a lot of similarities with the framework as well that the FERD has for the water and sewer policies that have been adopted by the board previously. I'll just highlight one area that we probably paid a little bit more attention to in this one, beyond those others as well. We've obviously done a lot of customization for flood hazard management services in electoral areas, but you'll see a lot more body in the interagency collaboration and relationships section of this policy as well, just recognizing that floods really transcend boundaries, and that this is a sort of a key area that is maybe a little bit more unique with relation to flood hazard management services. The first part of the policy relates to just service delivery. So we have the policies to guide the establishment, design, operations, and maintenance of existing flood hazard management infrastructure. Again, just highlighting that the focus really is the existing and any potential future local service areas within electoral areas. And the objective here is to ensure that flood hazard management infrastructure in the electoral areas safeguards the public and protects property. We've got some conditions here that are set out, basically saying that the FERD would typically not establish or expand flood hazard management service areas unless these criteria are met, that the FERD owns the infrastructure, that the system is designed to be financially sustainable, that there's appropriate access and legal tenure in place, like if there's any need for any statutory rights of way for access to maintain infrastructure, for example, that those are in place, and that all government approvals that would have been required for that infrastructure, that they're in place as well. So these are just some high-level guardrails in terms of conditions under which the FERD will establish or expand service areas. With respect to expanding services, there's a policy here that the FERD will extend or expand services at the request of property owners. And so again, just highlighting the voluntary nature of service delivery in regional districts. And if doing so is shown to be socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable. I know the Director of Engineering has spoken to that already, just making sure that there's sort of plans for financial sustainability in place, and that there would be a completion of a financial viability plan prior to extending or expanding any existing services. And we've touched on levels of service a little bit already in the discussion. And so again, there's familiarity with this concept that the for existing services, the base level of service is the infrastructure is operating as designed. But the policy, it certainly facilitates opportunities to upgrade to an expanded level of service that would meet like today's standards and includes considerations for climate change. But we recognize that those service delivery decisions in a regional district context, again, they're voluntary. They require assent processes and commitments to cost recovery for those services. So the policy, it does speak to that. And then for proposed new infrastructure, as opposed to existing infrastructure, the base level of service is that it is designed to meet today's standards and design guidelines, and an expanded level of service would be over and above even today's minimum standards. I'm cognizant of our time, so I'm gonna keep breezing through, but stop me if you would like to on anything. On 1.10 hydrometric monitoring, just a quick note here that as many of you probably know, the FERD is not currently responsible for any hydrometric monitoring and flood forecasting. And so the policy points us back to staff consulting with the best available data from both the federal government and the province to inform decision making. So that moves us into section 2, which is governance and jurisdiction. So these are policies to guide decision making on flood hazard management.
I do have some questions.
Yeah,
Jonathan.
okay, Director Davidson, sorry, just got a question here.
So going back to part 1, a few comments. So if we're talking about establishing service areas, I think what would be very helpful to see in the policy is criteria for inclusion of a proposed service area coming forth from the regional district. Um, any sort of criteria would established up front would help steer future discussions that I'm pretty sure we're going to be having, such as direct versus indirect benefit, border properties. If you're looking at somebody who's being potentially on the border, right at the border of a proposed service area dealing with flood management, um, what's the rule if, for example, if you're going based on elevation of the property relevant to a dike? If the property's straddling that elevation, or 80% within or 80% out, or where the improvements, policies that sort of speak to that, or criteria that speak to that, would be helpful. The other thing I'm looking for is on the financial viability side. Are we going to have criteria around essentially, if you look at a proposed service area and you think that, well, it's got 30 properties in it that we think will have a direct benefit, but if we include 10 additional ones that have a lesser indirect benefit, do we go ahead with 40 properties, knowing that those 10 ones getting taxed for an indirect benefit won't be too keen on it, knowing that the 30 that are all for the more direct benefit will vote in favor, and essentially gerrymandering these potential service areas in order to help with financial viability. That's, in my mind, is kind of a pretty potentially nasty discussion to be having, and establishing criteria ahead of time would be helpful. The other one that comes to my mind too is when you're looking at service area boundaries, when you've got, for example, a dike that's built to a specific design standard, but those design standards change as a result of new information coming in around climate change. Somebody says, yeah, it's fine today, but it needs to be 2 feet higher. For climate change, we think it needs to be 2 feet higher than what it is right now, which would presumably be providing more direct benefit to additional properties not currently in the service area. How do we manage that? And that's something that I'd really like to see sort of thought about in this policy. I know I'm kind of dumping a lot of stuff on this, on the hydrometric monitoring. So, typical dike is, my understanding, it's built to a 200-year event design standard. But in the Hatzic area right now, we've had 2 atmospheric river events in 2021 and 2024, and both have been described by our consultants as 100-year events per provincial hydrometric data. And going over to AI, I'll ask it a question like, okay, what's the probability of 2 100-year events happening within 3 years? And the answer is like 0.0297%, which suggests that our hydrometric modeling information is suspect. It's a high probability that it's simply incorrect. So I'm not comfortable just saying that hydrometric modeling is going to be the responsibility of the province and we design to that standard when that standard is very probably incorrect. And I know as part of the work in the Hatzic, they did extensive flood modeling, which presumably needs to be informed by hydrometric modeling. But if we sit back and just wait for the province to give us data at the provincial rate, there's, in my mind, a high risk that we're building substandard infrastructure as a result. And I think that's it for my questions on Area 1.
Thank you, Director Davidson. These are complicated situations. Do we have
Yeah, thanks for those comments and questions. And I think we can certainly take many of those back into consideration with the staff team. I heard a lot of interest in providing more parameters around the potential like geographies of service areas. And I think that's an interesting um, discussion, especially given that you pointed out how there's both like direct and indirect benefits. And I think Aaron was mentioning examples where, in some cases, there are communities with larger service areas, recognizing that, dikes, they often also protect critical infrastructure. So it might not be that a person, lives in the area or has property in the area that's protected by a dike, but maybe they use a road that travels across the area that's protected by a dike. So that would be a pretty basic example of what you might see. And, there are decisions to be made around how service areas are established with considerations like that in mind. So yeah, I appreciate those comments. I think I'd probably look to the FBRD team or Steve or Aaron to comment on hydrometric monitoring. Certainly that's like the policy articulates like the current approach and provides just parameters on what the current approach is at this point in time, and any sort of decisions to provide different level of monitoring. Those are decisions that impact like the level of service delivery and funding that is required as well.
Okay.
So I don't know if anyone has anything they'd like to add to that. I can keep on moving on. In the interest of time, maybe I'll switch over to part 2 on governance and jurisdiction. And so, yeah, again, these are policies that guide decision making with respect to services and also provide a clear understanding. There's a bit of an educational aspect here as well for residents on the responsibility and scope of service delivery. So I won't go into this table in great detail, but we added this to the policy working with the staff team just to outline what the current FBRD role is in various different contexts. And so we've got, existing service areas, local service areas. Obviously, the FBRD is a key role there to maintain services in accordance with the establishment bylaw. We've got improvement district contexts. So where officially the FBRD doesn't have a role, except there are cases, as you're keenly aware, Nikuman Island and now discussions with respect to the Hatsik, where, either through grant funding or relationships and partnerships, there's possibilities of a role for the FBRD. So I think that's an interesting point of discussion. And we are looking for your feedback, especially on this slide. And whereas you as directors feel that the FBRD, where your role is in some of these examples. The next two, electoral area land outside of an FBRD or improvement district service area, and also crown land. Those can be examples where sometimes you as directors, I would imagine, get some commentary from residents. Hey, what about this situation or this emergency event that's happening? Maybe the FBRD doesn't actually have a service delivery responsibility, but there could be orphaned infrastructure, for example, that's needing some attention, or some flood events that are needing attention. And officially, you don't have a service area and ability to respond to those things. But as the local government representatives, you get asked about those things. And then there's partnerships and relationships with First Nation communities, and also your relationship, obviously, with your member municipalities, where they're responsible for flood hazard management services within their boundaries. And so, yeah, this is just setting out that framework for where there is a role in the electoral areas. And as you can see, there's a bit of a key discussion point here. And when the FBRD, and sort of established by your direction as directors and through consultation with your residents and the assent processes to establish services where it makes sense to step in. So I'm happy to take any questions or comments or that, or we can move on in the interest of time as well.
Director Donald.
Thanks very much. I found it really interesting to read the entire document and the one previous this as well. I have a few questions, one of which will be related to the cost recovery model. Is it even possible that there's a cost recovery model that would work with any new development with respect to this? So if you're building a 10-unit subdivision, for example, and you have a $1 million output immediately for diking that or for protecting it based on the new level or the current level of requirements, how would we possibly recover that through taxation without federal or provincial assistance? Is that correct assumption that we 100% require that in order to pull off something like this?
Are you speaking in terms of like a new development type of
Yeah, and
context?
so a new development they would submit a proposal, and then based on current standards of flood mitigation protection, they would require to do so much. It's not even feasibly possible to recover the cost to the new owners as well as the developer.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think in that sort of example, I mean, there's certainly like a development viability like context, like right out of the gates. Like, is that development even viable in the first place? Like, if there's only a small number of properties and a high level of new flood protection infrastructure is required. So that jumps to mind for me right away. But like maybe in terms of another context, maybe you've got a larger development and a developer has the capacity to provide some flood infrastructure. This policy does provide context that FERD, like land use planning staff and engineering, can work with going through the approvals process to provide guidance on the financial sustainability of that infrastructure and the FERD's ability to, working with future property owners to take on the operation and maintenance cost associated with that infrastructure. So that definitely is something that would need to be looked at through any sort of land use approvals process if there's to be like new diking infrastructure. And there's also consideration in the policy for not sort of front loading cost necessarily like on a small number of property owners, like in an initial phase, like of a larger sort of master plan development. That is consideration, like maybe it would need to be a contribution from a developer into a reserve fund, say, to help like basically like balance out tax impacts over time. So that sort of content has definitely found its way into the policy. There's a lot that speaks to just considering the financial sustainability of services as they're established. And I think we'll move into some of that as well as we get to the cost recovery section of the document.
And thank you. And throughout this process, did we take into account any of the climate change studies that have been out with respect to flood mitigation? Is that part of this whole process as well? Climate change versus emergency management or emergency actions as a result of flooding?
Yeah, so I think like just back to that other table that we had with respect to the levels of service. Whoops, just went past it. Just with this existing infrastructure, the expanded levels of service, that speaks to considering like climate change impacts and models, like as infrastructure is upgraded, that like the FERD would seek to meet present day standards. And then with proposed infrastructure, for any new infrastructure that would come, like say through development, that it would be designed to like present day like design standards, which should reflect climate change like modeling. And your land use and engineering staff would be looking at that, I think, closely through any sort of land use approvals process. So short answer is yes, absolutely.
Okay, so maybe just on this issue about the approval of subdivisions, we already have procedures in place that no one's getting any layout approvals without addressing flood construction levels and hazard abatement, I'm sure. I don't know.
Mr. Chair, yes, it is.
Director Castle.
Thank you, Chair Dickey. FERD role when to step in. I mean, the way that we operate, the way we provide services is when when the residents are willing to pay for the service. But I also want to, just point out that your chart headings say excluding emergency response. So my question is, with regards to when to step in, where do hazard management and emergency management intersect? And if the FERD is responsible for emergency management, and through that work, we identify that there are hazards that could be managed better or should be managed better in order to improve our ability to manage a emergency, where do those two intersect?
Yeah, thank you through the chair. There's clearly like a relationship. And I think like the policy is somewhat separate, like from the emergency management function, because we are speaking to like generally local service areas that are specifically established for flood hazard management. But we point to the FERD emergency management plan as well as a contextual piece, and like there's a relationship between those two aspects. And so you've got like a function that operates on a more regional basis in terms of emergency management, and this policy is a bit more narrow in terms of defining how the FERD deals with local service areas. But like certainly, there's overlap in terms of like the planning functions that are associated like with broader flood hazard management. And I think that speaks as well to how the FERD is involved in discussions around say the HATSIC, for example, thinking about potential future roles that take a wider look than just sort of management of like a local service area or improvement district function, and sort of a broader sort of service. But yeah, it's sort of, we're dealing with this is, I think, it's a function a little bit of just regional district governance and service delivery.
Well, and when you mentioned the HATSIC, I believe a lot of the work that's happening today in the HATSIC is as a result of the emergency response in 2021. The challenges in the HATSIC have existed for decades, but it's as a result of an event that the FERD and the City of Mission had to respond to, that has now prompted Will to roll up our sleeves and do the work to mitigate those hazards based on the emergency response that was needed. So again, I don't know if there's language that can be included in policy that speaks to that, but that's just food for thought for me.
Good. Thank you, Director Castle. Director McElhonick.
Thank you. So I'm director with Area E, which has the most of the projects out there. So, I mean, these are really concerning when we have things that are built that meet standards when they're built, like they'll use 1948, but like recently with the Wilson Road dike and what happened in 2021, and we have to pay, the residents can't pay for it. We don't have the funding, so we have to rely on government grants and kind of get things like that. So we have like a pretty big need out there because of the landscape, and so but we have a bare budget. We're very rural, not a large tax base. So, I mean, I think this is really important to have these guidelines and policies in place so that it's very clear. But we're also looking at, we're looking at the flood information, but we're also looking at slope hazards at the same time in a study. So I'm not sure if we're going to be putting those together, but when I hear somebody talking about development, I mean, people that in good faith went ahead and had development plans, everything's on hold now, a lot of things because of 2021 and things. So yeah, I think it's really important that we have some clear guidelines. It makes me a little nervous that we have, our baseline, from when they were put in place, the idea of it. But financially, I mean, we don't have the resources to do anything else. So I was reading through all of this, and I don't know what the answers are, but I think that we're going to run into more trouble as time goes by. But at least we have some benchmarking and some levels. But how do we find funding in an area like mine? We're certainly not going to be having a lot more development to have that tax base to pay for any of this either. So, yeah. Anyway, I appreciate the work that's been done. I appreciate the way it's laid out. It just really helps, and I think it'll be a really good educational tool for people that are in the development stage, looking at development, or just residents that are living in these areas that are impacted. And I've been working, and I'm still advocating for residents that have lost their homes or they're deemed unsafe. There's no resources. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Good. Thank you, Director Makahonic. Director Davidson.
Just sharing some further comments on the emergency management intersect with all this. It's from what I've seen in the HATSIC, it's interesting where the whole premise of emergency management and the EDMA and response and recovery mode is to build back to how things were just prior to the incident and no more. However, the reality is a little bit more complicated than that. In building and in restoring things back during recovery, where we are now, one of the principles was it has to be done to current design standards, which leads to what nominally should be an potential improvement over what was before, but also baked into the whole emergency management mindset is we don't build back better, but we still have to build back to design standards. So there's something of a contradiction in there, and but my takeaway from the whole thing is that unless you've got that state of local emergency that's been declared, the emergency management, recovery response mode just doesn't relate. And to have that state of local emergency, you need to meet certain criteria, like it's actually doing damage to properties. So anyway, I see them as being distinct, but related, but certainly manageable separately. Just wanted to share. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Director Davidson. Mr. Lucas or
Yeah, pretty close. Good job.
Lucas?
Clucas, yeah.
Lucas, excuse me.
Yeah, you're right on. Yeah, just key policy directions in terms of governance. Again, considering short and long-term social, economic, and environmental impacts. We've got 2.2 that the board maintains decision-making authority, and decision-making will be delegated to a commission or other body. Again, that doesn't preclude like an innovative governance model. That's sort of clear at the outset of the policy. And then just the importance of engagement and education as well. I'll move into cost recovery here. So I think there's been some discussion around this already, just in terms of how cost associated with providing services should be recovered. And that speaks to considerations around like the geography of service areas and so on as well. So first off, the FERD will take proactive measures to ensure that sufficient funding is available to provide the achievable level of flood hazard management services. That speaks to just the sort of the goal setting around level of service as well. There's some potential here for discussion around just the notion of pooling costs and revenues. Like currently, we're in a context where we have a number of distinct local service areas that all have their unique costs that are associated with those individual pieces of infrastructure in each service area. That said, you're realizing sort of an economy of scale already in the way that you deal with the engineering function and all services, contributing towards like the engineering function that provides service to all of those local service areas. So that'd be sort of an example at a smaller scale of pooling costs and revenues, but just in the context of other service delivery discussions that are going on, it might be an area of interest for discussion. And then I'll just keep going here. The user pay principle as well. This sort of conveys the idea that service area boundaries will be expanded only if the cost of doing so is done so by the newly serviced area. So, say there's like a dike that, like the geography, it makes sense for whatever reason to expand it, provides more protection to new properties. The idea is that like the cost of the extension of the service area is paid for by the newly serviced area.
Okay, got some questions here, Director Davidson and then Director Castle.
Right, thank you. So on that cost per lot in brackets there, are we basically talking then you're saying that we will do parcel taxes and no other cost recovery method? Or am I inferring too much into that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it speaks necessarily to like the form of tax here, but like had that said, like parcel taxes are clearly a common way of like recovering like costs for like capital projects and so on.
So I guess I'd like to see this a little bit more clear on that, because when you look at cost recovery methods, I mean there's a whole range of ways of doing it. And I'm honestly not sure which ones are even allowable for a service area. For example, you've got parcel tax, you can do it based on assessed value. I know that in Abbotsford, there's the Sumas Drainage District, and I think Matsqui Drainage does it the same way. But for Sumas, it's based on area. So the actual taxation for property is based on how many how many hectares are within that district, and even within that, they've tiered it so that properties that are at the bottom of what would be Sumas Lake pay a higher rate per hectare than properties that are further up the lake. All in all, is sort of tied to the principle that the amount of taxation is tied to the relation of a perceived degree of benefit. And is that possible for a service area? I'd certainly like to, in this policy, see a more deeper dive into the cost recovery methods that are available to us and what would we do. Because to be honest, when it comes down to if you are able to do something relative to degree of benefit, then that speaks to, do you include properties that are only seeing an indirect benefit or not into a proposed service area? So the dependencies are a bit complicated here, and I'm just hoping to get more clarity, hopefully, into this policy, so we're not, when we come to future discussions, we've got a baseline to start from.
Good. Thank you, Director Davis. I see Mr. Islam has something that he'd like to add.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add to this. Typically, any cost recovery, we go to the establishment of the service area, and we kind of keep that open and try to use as much as type of taxation possible. So it keeps us that flexibility on choosing the best. So staff would go through a service area model and figure out what is the best way to recover that cost. So those things will be part of the service area establishment. So user pay could be requisition, it could be parcel tax, but we don't want to go to that detail into this this policy. Staff can look into that when we're establishing the service area to figure out what's the best. But we typically keep, again, saying the same thing. We typically keep all of them in the establishment of the service area, so we can choose whatever method we want or respect.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Islam, Director Castle, and then Director Adam.
Thank you, Chair Dickey. And just to pick up on that point, I think for myself as well as Director Davidson, hoping to maybe see some direction on how we choose those in this policy. Completely agree with wanting to keep all of our options open, but as Director Davidson and I are in the thick of this exact topic, looking to creation of some guiding principles or a policy that helps staff, direct staff in those choosing so that it's not murky when we are then presenting it to the public. And also just want to, a lot of this is around electoral areas, and this is the Electoral Area Services Committee, so that's all good and well. But in the Hatzic, we have a member municipality that is just as motivated to do this work as what the electoral areas are. And so ensuring that there is policy that reflects inclusion of 12 homes in the city of Mission, right? And how we kind of navigate through that. Again, that might already be baked into the service area creation process. But when we're talking about pooling costs and revenues, how do we establish again the municipality's share of that cost recovery?
Thank you, Director Castle. Director Adamo.
Thanks very much. I'm not actually sure if this is a question for anyone, more of an observation, but there may be a question coming out depending on how I word it. With respect to service areas, if we don't live within any of the service areas, but the requirements for a flood mitigation program improvement or correction are still required. And my example would be, so if you live in Prince George, everything is trucked or railed to Prince George through our area, everything. So are they paying, how do we determine how much they're paying for the services in terms of flood mitigation to protect, say, the Abbotsford Dike and the rail system? Highway 7 goes down, Highway 1 goes down, there is no trucking throughout the entire province. So are they expected to pay, or do they? I'm sure they do pay, but how is that determined? Does anybody know that? Because we're all expected to pay for it somehow, but that's a different service area and a different jurisdiction, but it's all coming through our service area.
Okay, thank you, Director Adamo. Those are good points you bring up on the cost sharing. Are we getting outside of the parameters of this?
That's okay.
Okay, thank you. Did Mr. Islam want to respond? No? Okay, good. Thank you. So I think after we have Director Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I'm just looking at 3.2 pooling costs. It says key discussion point, and we haven't really discussed it yet in any great detail. So I'm just looking for a little more, I guess, an expansion on that, and what would kick in a region-wide services for flood hazard management activities, those kind of things.
Right. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I did highlight that as sort of an area that the directors might be interested in exploring. The policy statement sort of is quite like permissive and open. It's basically just saying that the FERD will explore opportunities to pool costs and revenues across service areas. I think we recognize like some inherent like challenges in that, just with the way that your local service areas that you have for flood protection right now, they're like quite geographically distinct from one another. And if you've got like widely varying tax rates, say between one service area and another, there might be some challenges, getting property owners and residents sort of interested in the idea of like, hey, why don't we just have like one, flood management function for all of these like service areas, or maybe just the service areas that are in one electoral area. It's one service area. We can pool costs and revenues for all of those. And then, it's sort of one blended tax rate for all of those service areas. That's sort of like that's like the far end of the spectrum of what pooling costs and revenues potentially looks like. And obviously there's also the exploration of like broader sub-regional and regional services. And that's also sort of another example at that end of the spectrum of what pooling costs and revenues looks like. And then the other end of the spectrum obviously is like distinct local service areas. And so it's just sort of opening the door to discussion, and maybe even as more services are established or as the FERD considers taking on any like existing services, like what opportunities are there for pooling costs and revenues, and does that make sense in the circumstances? But the policy doesn't bind the board like in any way. It's it's sort of an exploratory statement, and so it's an area where we're sort of curious for your feedback on that. Just the service delivery context of the region, and what resonates with you on that and what doesn't.
Okay, good. Thank you, Director Dixon. Director Davidson.
Thank you, Chair. So on the pooling costs and revenues, sometimes I think of the whole service area model, depending whether it's these little small ones, whether it's for flood or water or whatever, versus the broader ones. Sometimes I paraphrase it in my mind is to speaking to the other EA directors. I got my problems, you got your problems. Sometimes we have our problems. And we proceed on that basis, and we share cost or not, depending on basically what we think about it. I personally see kind of a challenge in trying to share, for example, all maintenance costs across all of these districts, simply because they're going to be quite different. And especially if you're looking at trying to prioritize future projects across all districts, all service areas. I see that as being a little bit of a challenge. Where I do see opportunity for some of the more generic things, like we know for HATSIC, one of the outputs from the provincial work being done there, the HATSIC task force out of the 2021 ARE, is a flood model, and that flood model, it's being done once, but it needs to be maintained long term to maintain its value, and I can see that having certainly for electoral area F. Electoral area wide benefit, because people want to know, is there property at risk or not? What kind of risk is it at? So I can see kind of extending that across multiple EAs, but I think on the sort of more narrow context of maintaining pooling resources for just day-to-day maintenance of these things, I'd be challenged by it. Yeah, I have another comment, but that's coming up. I'll hold that back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Director Davis. So how are we doing here on our timeline? Are we going to get through this?
Chair Dickey, we had budgeted about 25 minutes for the presentation and then add some questions. However, I anticipated that this would be a topic of interest and that we would likely spend an hour on this subject. So we are at the 1 hour and 15-minute mark. We're happy to do whatever you wish.
And
we do
more do we have coming our way? And
I think I could be pretty concise. Like there's sort of one more key discussion point upcoming, and I don't need to go through every policy statement. You've got the benefit of that in your report, and if happy to sort of take any other key questions that arise, but I'd be happy to just breeze through the final few slides here. And
yeah. Okay, thank you, Mr. Klukas. We'll let you continue.
Okay. So yeah, this is sort of the one area actually where we were interested in the director sort of input as well. Obviously, we're interested in all the sections, but in the priority setting framework, in many cases, the FERD's priorities for capital projects will be quite clear, but there might be some cases where there's decisions that need to be made between service and capital project priorities. And so the policy, just as the water and sewer policies do, it provides a priority setting framework to basically like compile detailed project information in step one so you can compare them, to compare those projects with the FERD's established priorities. So that's what I'd like to talk about with you. Consider cost per lot. That came up in the discussion already today. So that's obviously a key consideration is, what's the cost of infrastructure required and how much does it benefit, what number of properties, and then also to evaluate against social and economic and environmental priorities as well. So that's the overall framework. We were interested in your comment on the FERD's established priorities, and we've just basically taken a stab at this, like based on our assessment of what we think those would be, but we're interested in your feedback if any of these need to sort of be rearranged. And so just walking through them very quickly, it would be a priority if the FERD was ordered by the province to accept ownership or undertake mitigation efforts or implement new requirements. Number two is sustaining existing levels of service. So that's like base level of service to manage flood risk. And then three is improving the financial sustainability of flood management services. Four would be enhancing the level of services to existing service areas. So that's, again, speaking to that climate change, like considerations, meeting modern day standards in services. And then we get down to the fifth and sixth priorities to implement new service areas, first extensions for existing development or service areas, and then new ones for new development. So yeah, just curious for any feedback on sort of the order of priorities and what resonates with the directors there. And then I'm happy to just breeze through the final closing slides here just to give you a quick landscape.
Okay, any discussion, Director Dixon?
Just for clarification, on number 5, yeah, I guess both 5 and 6, where it says service area extensions, would that be required to, do people have to do an assent vote to be part of a service area extension, or do we just add them in?
Yeah, staff could help clarify, but I think like there would be the typical options for establishing a service area when you're extending them to use a referendum or go through the AAP process, or yeah, there's one more established. Just it'd be the conventional methods that the regional district uses.
Yeah, through Mr. Chair, yeah, we will, if we are extending any existing service area, we have to go through the public assent process, the petition, referendum, or AAP. And we will also have to define the cost if new extension would be paid by the new service. It's not that the people or the original service will be paying towards it. So we will figure out those things, informations before we go to the public.
Good, thank you, Director Dixon. Director Wardenberg.
Yeah, through the chair to present. Just one thing, I guess the other part of the study, you'll come up with some risk assessments for our existing infrastructure. And as that comes out, then that should establish some priorities. Am I correct?
Yeah, for sure. So we would use this framework. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. So we will gather all of those projects and issues that come out of the gap assessment, and then we'll actually be using this framework as a first cut at kind of prioritizing. So yeah, it would be used for that.
Okay, good. Thank you, Wardenberg. Moving on.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So you've seen these already in your package. I won't dwell on them. There's quite a number of policies related to guiding acquisition of existing or new flood hazard management services. And again, just reiterating here that the FERD doesn't proactively seek to own additional infrastructure, but there are examples that you see here where the FERD will consider those, and obviously they'd have to go through the typical assent processes and so on. So we outline how the acquisition process would be initiated, considering the FERD's overall capacity to acquire. We've spoken already about financial viability of the infrastructure and so on. So there's a lot of meat in the policy on that content. And then the final part is an important one as well, just guiding the relationships with other bodies and pursuing successful collaboration in addressing flood hazard management. So we have components that speak to a number of different relationships that the FERD has in flood hazard management. This first one obviously is quite important, just the Indigenous relationship building, and again, recognizing that the FERD's got a commitment through its strategic plan to build relationships and work towards reconciliation, and that through efforts on flood hazard management, like is being done in the HATSIC that, you know, the FBRD will continue to embark in a process of relationship building and exploring where there's mutual interest in flood hazard management. So the policy speaks to that, and also opportunities to continue exploring and engaging with improvement districts. Just a key one on improvement districts is that, you know, as you're already doing, the FBRD may support improvement districts on flood hazard management infrastructure, but the key there is that staff time just needs to be recoverable through external funding sources. So that's the goal that's set out in the policy. And then the policy also speaks to federal provincial relationships and exploring jointly beneficial projects, and then seeking opportunities for multi-jurisdictional service delivery. And I think, again, back to the HATSIC, we've said it a few times today, that's a great example of what that can look like in practice. So thanks for your patience as we wrap that up, and happy to take any final comments or questions.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Klukas. Director Davidson.
Thank you, Chair. Just two final comments, knowing that this is a draft, and I'll leave it with you to consider as you will. 5.4, I think there's the line in there that says won't proceed with electoral area assent process until grant has been secured. I think that's in the policy itself, or the draft policy. But to my understanding, I think a lot of grant programs out there have service area establishment as a prerequisite. So I think there's I could be wrong, but my take on that was that there's a potential chicken and egg issue here, if you follow that. The other thing that I thought is important to work in the conversation is that just because a property is within a given service area, my understanding is there's basically no guarantee that that property is going to be protected from floods. And if you're looking at ranking various projects, it could well be that a given property owner within that service area is basically told, yeah, you're in the service area, you pay taxes for it, but you're not going to get any service that your own property would be the only benefit from. And that, of course, can lead into discussions of managed retreat. We know the province has come out and said that managed retreat should be initiated locally. And I think it makes sense to, or worth consideration anyway, to include a discussion of managed retreat policies, process, etc., in a document like this. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Davidson. Maybe someone could explain to me what managed retreat is.
Yeah, Aaron might want to speak to that, but I think what I'm hearing is a director basically speaking about the notion that in certain circumstances, in extremely prone areas, that it might not make sense to continue having improvements on a property necessarily, and so a managed retreat would be a process to essentially sort of move development back out of the hazard area, if you will. I think that's probably my best crack at it.
I can help a little bit. There have been instances, Chair Dickey, where municipalities have chosen to buy properties in these flood-prone areas and relocate those individuals to other places that are safer.
Great, thank you. Director Wardenberg.
One last thing through the chair to staff. Where will you find these provincial guidelines? And if you could send me a link to where I could find them, that would be great.
We can get that. Great, thank you. Good. I do not see any other discussion. So with that, we thank you, Mr. Klukas and Mr. Colho. Is that the correct pronunciation? Well, Coelho. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, and Mr. Brubaker always. So yeah, really appreciate your presentation today.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. And Ms. Kinnaman.
Thank you. So we now move to item 6.1, which is the draft Electoral Area Services Committee meeting minutes of January 16th, 2025.
For a motion, move Director Downwell, second Director Dixon. All those in favor, contrary, motion carries.
7.1 is a 2025 grant and aid application for the McConnell Creek Farmers Institute in Electoral Area F.
Motion, move
Davidson,
Davidson, second Director Johnson. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor, contrary, motion carries.
7.3 is a 2025 grant and aid request for the Hemlock Valley Homeowners Association in Electoral Area C.
Move Director Wardenberg, second Director Johnson. Discussion, hearing none. All in favor, contrary, motion carries.
8.1 is the Showmax landfill operation contract extension.
Looking for a motion, move Director Johnson, second Director McCahonick. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor, contrary, motion carries.
8.2 is the Fraser Valley Regional District Water Supply Systems Fees and Charges Amendment Bylaw number 1765.
Motion, Director Castle, second Director Dow. Any discussion? Hearing, Director Dixon, go ahead.
Well, it's more a comment. I certainly did see when I was looking through this that, as with many things in the regional district, we appear to have a multitude of ways to bill people and collect funds, and some are semi-annual, it seems. There's monthly rates in some cases, and is there ever any thought of somehow making that a little simpler?
I will rely on our CFO to comment on that. She's joining us online, but my understanding generally is that these methods are all at a service area establishment level, and so that's largely the reason. But I will just look to see if we've got either Beth Klein or Kelly Lonsborough online to answer that question in terms of how we collect fees for the various services that we have.
Hi there. Through the chair, to answer the question, yes, the information is complicated. We have a number of service area bylaws and a number of processes. From a staff perspective as well as a customer perspective, we would certainly welcome alignment. This is one of the early stages of doing that alignment, is bringing them all into one bylaw. Over time, perhaps we can get there, but I think it will be a bit of a slow process to align the fees, but we have been trying to make some progress. And as I say, this is a first step in getting them all under one bylaw.
Okay, thank you.
Good, thank you. Director Dixon. Ms. Kinnaman, we're looking for a vote on this, I guess. All those in favor, contrary, motion carries.
Thank you. So moving to item 8.3, which is the Fraser Valley Regional District Sewer Systems Regulation Fees and Charges Establishment Bylaw number 1768.
For a motion, move Director Johnson, second Director Wardenberg. Discussion, Director Wardenberg.
Through the chair to staff, just for some clarification on the Morris Valley sewer system. Is the Morris Valley sewer system services three stratas, correct? So I guess my question would be, under this combined service area bylaw here, how would the fines be distributed? Like, so if a person in one of the stratas, in one of the houses in one of the stratas broke the bylaw in any way, who gets the fine? Does it come to the actual strata, or does it come to the homeowner itself?
That would go to the strata, not to the individual homeowner. We don't own the collection systems within those strata, so we only know what's coming out of the strata's collection system into ours.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director Wardenberg. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, contrary, motion carries.
9.1 is the framework for consideration of soil-related development applications and referrals. And we do have a staff presentation this afternoon by Andrea Antefeyev.
Welcome, Ms. Antefeyev.
All right, good afternoon. I'm Andrea Antipaeff and I work in the Electoral Area Planning Department. And I'm here to talk to you today about the framework for the consideration of soil-related development applications and referrals. So a little bit about how we got here as a refresher from when we were here in November. So there's an increasing amount of large-scale soil deposits in the FERD, particularly on agricultural land, leading to community concerns about traffic, odors, potential air and water impacts, and the potential to alter the natural flow of watercourses, which may impact flood mitigation efforts. Soil-related applications present several challenges to the FERD's limited and variable regulatory authority. For example, soil deposits are generally outside the scope of zoning bylaws. The current tools and authorities available to the FERD are at best partial and insufficient for managing soil deposits effectively. As a result, these tools may fall short of the public and even the board's expectations for the effective regulation of soil deposit. In November, staff were directed to develop a framework summarizing the FERD's existing authority for soil deposit applications. We're just going to do a brief overview of the applications we have currently, and these are also in the staff report. So we see different application types for soil deposit components, ALC referrals, development permits, and we have a temporary use permit right now. Currently, there's 4 ALC referrals, which include large-scale soil deposits, 2 development permit applications, and 1 temporary use permit, which a portion of it is for soil-related for the potential storage of recreational vehicles in the future. In addition to these applications, there have been approximately 20 bylaw enforcement files open for soil deposit in 2024. Some of these bylaw enforcement files may result in either a development permit or an ALC application. The goals of the framework are to provide consistency by establishing a standardized approach for evaluating soil-related applications, transparency by clearly communicating FERD's regulatory authority, limitations, and responsibilities to all parties. It can define the extent that the FERD can address public concerns and identify opportunities for sharing relevant information with other agencies. While the framework doesn't give staff any new powers or resolve any of the challenges the FERD experiences with soil-related applications and referrals, the framework acts as a guide and identifies the different authorities that the FERD has and sets out the limitations and considerations for each application type. For ALC referrals, the board has the discretion on whether or not to forward the application to the ALC for consideration, but the FERD has no regulatory control or assurance once the application has been forwarded to the ALC. For development permits, there is a narrow applicability. For example, the FERD can only address geohazard aspects or riparian values. With development permits, there's a professional reliance model, meaning that compliance with development permit conditions relies on the accountability of the qualified professional who authored the report, often providing a letter of assurance and commitment, including post-construction reporting. While staff play a continuous role in reviewing applications and setting out conditions and responding to complaints, it is neither practical nor expected for them to conduct frequent or ongoing inspections to ensure development permit works are in compliance with the permit issue. The approach acknowledges the limited resources of the FERD and the necessity of placing the responsibility on the qualified professional. As a result, the expectation of monitoring should be tempered when it comes to staff capacity for week-to-week monitoring. Staff involvement is typically reactive, responding to complaints, reviewing submissions at key milestones, and ensuring the conditions of the approval are met, rather than proactively conducting inspections for development permits. We're here today to talk about 3 aspects of the framework. For development permits, we're talking about the issuance of the actual development permit and that authority. For ALC applications, we're talking about the request for additional technical reports and deciding whether or not to forward the application to the ALC for consideration or refusing to forward it to the ALC for consideration. In regards to development permit applications, they have a narrow review scope, focusing exclusively on compliance with specific development permit area guidelines. They're not a comprehensive approval of all works, but address only specific aspects of the development. As non-discretionary permits, they must be issued if the application meets the established guidelines in the development permit area. Currently, the FERD procedures bylaw delegates the authority to issue development permits, excluding those for form and character, to the Director of Planning. An alternative outlined in the development procedure bylaw would allow staff to present soil deposit related permits or any other development permit to Eastcan Board for issuance. Staff have concerns that if the board considers and issues development permits, this may create the perception that the board has discretion over their approval. This could mislead the public, as development permits are non-discretionary and cannot be used as a tool to address the community impacts or the general merits of the soil deposit. Staff recommendation is to retain the Director of Planning's delegated authority, as this approach reduces the risk of implying that the board endorses or approves any activities related to soil deposit. The second aspect of the framework that we're here to talk to today is about the ALC applications and the request for technical reports. When it comes to technical reports that accompany ALC applications, the FERD has a responsibility of understanding the application details before considering whether or not to forward the application for consideration to the ALC. In the past, staff have requested additional technical reports from applicants to better assess off-site impacts such as drainage, broader flood impacts, access and egress, traffic management, and soil quality. The alternative to the past approach is that staff do not require or request any further technical reports besides those that have been submitted at the time of application to the ALC. Staff have concerns that the FERD lacks the authority to require field reviews or post-construction reporting to verify compliance with these technical assessments. The FERD is not the approving authority, and the responsibility should sit with the agency who is the authority, the ALC. Recent legal review emphasized that the FERD's discretion under Section 25(3) of the ALC Act is tied to its land use authority, meaning decisions should remain focused on land use considerations rather than indirectly regulating soil deposit. While the FERD has some discretion to request information, excessively shifting away from land use concerns or delaying a decision could be deemed unreasonable. Given these limitations, staff recommend against requesting additional technical reports, and instead the FERD should consider identifying broader land use and community impacts and highlighting gaps in technical reporting in their comments back to the ALC. The FERD's role should center on providing land use feedback, allowing the board to either comment on applications or decline to forward applications if significant concerns arise. This approach ensures clarity in roles, supports professional reliance on the ALC's expertise, and relies on existing ALC policies. By avoiding overreaching of its authority, the FERD can foster effective communication with the ALC to address incomplete applications and gaps in evidence. The final topic in the framework is the actual decision on the application. So staff have recommended 3 approaches for consideration of ALC applications within the framework. Option 1 would be refuse to forward applications which have significant area-wide soil deposits. Option 2, forward applications with comments where the board has concerns from a broader community impact lens, such as impacts on adjacent properties and cumulative floodplain issues. After having conversations from the ALC, we understand that the ALC prioritizes assessing the impacts of fill placement on the farming of ALR lands. Their decisions are guided by the ALC Act, which ensures that proposals align with agricultural objectives and do not compromise the integrity of adjacent farmlands. Property-wide fill placement undergoes greater scrutiny, particularly regarding drainage impacts and the impacts to the adjacent lands surrounding that property. In 2024, the ALC South Coast panel had rendered decisions on 17 fill placement applications. Of these applications, 13 were either fully or partially approved, primarily involving proposals to retain existing fill on site or moving that fill to new area within the property for agricultural, residential, or access-related purposes. Notably, none of the approved applications permitted area-wide fill placement, with the exception of one outlier involving the reclamation of a gravel pit. Option 3 would be to forward applications that are for minor soil deposits, such as driveway access and construction, building construction, or depression filling directly to the ALC for their consideration. Next step. So the framework was attached to the staff report as Appendix A and clarifies the FBRD's existing regulatory authority, provides a structured approach to evaluating soil deposit applications, and identifies area where the board has discretion. It aims to create a standardized approach for reviewing applications and referrals involving soil deposits. And by establishing clear guidelines, the framework ensures a transparent and consistent process for applicants, staff, and the board. If the board endorses the framework as drafted, staff will proceed in the process of bringing back the deferred files in alignment with the framework for consideration by the board. Thank you. And now we're open to discussion here today on 3 topics.
Good. Thank you, Ms. Antefeyev. Director Castle.
Thank you, Chair Diggy. Can we go back to the 3 option slides?
Yes.
Perfect.
Which one did you want?
Next one. Thank you. Yeah, with this one here, I agree with the staff recommendation, but I have the question of why would the board want to go with the alternative?
Yeah, so through the chair to Director Castle, we are not suggesting that that would be what the board wants to do. The staff recommendation would be to continue having the delegation, but we're highlighting that there is the opportunity in the development procedure bylaw for the board to consider these types of development permits or any development permit as it is.
And that's my question. Why would the board decide to want to see these applications as opposed to delegating?
Maybe Graham can speak to when the development procedure bylaw was created.
Thank you, if I may, through the chair. Some EA directors might want to have be a part of decision-making around development permits that address soil deposit. They're controversial and you might want to be involved in those approvals. I think that's the fundamental reason why you may want to make these decisions. But again, that's not the staff recommendation.
But my understanding of it, and not to minimize the work, but is it not a checklist? Like you either satisfy the checklist or you don't. So why would the board want to see that?
It is much like a checklist. A person is entitled to receive a development permit if they meet the guidelines and they show us to meet the guidelines. And development permits are narrow in focus. They deal only, for example, with the geohazard elements of the work. And it's not an opportunity, as Andrea said, to consider broadly the desirability of the works or whether they make sense or what community impacts they have other than if they transfer geohazard risk, for example. So I think there are a lot of reasons why the board might not want to get into it, but we realize that it's possible that some EA directors might want to be involved in those decisions, especially around the issuance of development permits in their communities, where it could be for a very sizable soil deposit operation that has a lot of community impact, and residents are going to be asking them, what were you thinking issuing this? You know, what was the regional district doing issuing these development permits? And EA directors will be left in a position that they really weren't involved in the issuance. And I think there are desirable elements about that, but there might be some uncomfortable moments too when residents ask those kinds of questions. So we thought we'd highlight it for your consideration. Our recommendation's clear, but we also didn't want to bury an opportunity for you to be involved in these development permits should you want to. We wanted to make that opportunity evident to you.
Thank you. Again, I agree with the staff recommendation. Can I see the next slide, please? What is the risk? Again, I agree with the staff recommendation. What is the risk to requesting additional technical reports?
Through the chair to Director Castle. So in the legal review we had with one of the FBRD's legal counsel, the recommendation was for the FBRD to stay in their lane, which is defined in the ALC Act as providing comments based on land use considerations. When we get into the details of technical reporting, asking for soil quality reports, soil quantity reports, lot grading, we step outside of you know, a general understanding of the soil that's being placed. We don't have a professional engineer, myself, to review these documents for compliance. And so they're nor we registered professional agrologists to review agrologist reports. And so the recommendation is to leave that with the experts at the ALC to determine if the submissions meet the technical standards that they should be meeting.
Perfect. And again, I agree with the staff recommendation. Thank you for outlining the risks. Next slide. And with this, like, is this that we have these three options, or are we wanting to decide on an option here?
Yeah, so through the chair to Director Castle, this would highlight the three options that would be. So when staff are reviewing an application, they would be looking at the merits of the application that are being considered. So how much soil is being deposited. So an application that was, say, for a minor soil deposit where someone was building a barn, say, for sheep, and we've seen 3,000 cubic meters coming to the property. And the understanding is it's centralized in one area for an agricultural use. That may be considered a minor deposit, no impacts to adjacent properties, where staff could recommend right away to forward the application. But where we see applications that are considering these area-wide deposits, they can be taken as two different recommendations from staff. Staff could recommend one for the significant area-wide deposits. So that would be saying filling an entire property, which we have seen in some applications. The staff recommendation could be to automatically recommend to not forward those applications to the ALC. But where we have applications where there's smaller parcels and there's an area that's being filled, and, you know, we think it might be okay, but, you know, we want to have that reliance back on the ALC, we can forward those applications to ALC for their consideration, highlighting what our concerns are. So if we're concerned that someone's placing fill and, you know, that may not be impacting the directly adjacent properties, but it could have cumulative floodplain impacts. So the soil could wash away if an event occurs on that property and go downstream and affect a neighboring property that you wouldn't consider directly adjacent. These are concerns that we could highlight to the ALC. So we're not recommending one of these options. We're just saying staff would review these three options when they're reviewing applications and deciding on how to come forward to the board for consideration of their recommendation.
Perfect. Thank you. I especially appreciate the refuse to forward applications with significant deposits. So yeah, thank you for this work. I'm really happy to see this report. I'm really pleased to be able to really understand the decision-making processes. I couldn't agree more with your opening comments about limited and variable regulations, and that fall short of the expectations of residents. I especially appreciate this work so that residents can understand when they have concerns, and the onus doesn't become onto the director to necessarily explain why fill can or cannot happen in their neighborhood. And I already know that it's being used by residents to understand that better. I know that there's going to be some more comments and questions, but at this point, when the time is right, happy to move the recommendation. So thank you for this work.
Good. Thank you, Director Castle. Director Wardenberg.
Yeah, to the chair and staff, thank you for the presentation. Very informative. The report is very informative. I just had a couple of questions as far as the development permits. So when you're issuing a development permit, and they meet all the criteria, is there a standard on how long that development or permit is good for?
Through the chair to Director Wardenberg. So when a development permit is issued, the applicant has 2 years to commence construction. So they would need to start the works within 2 years of that permit being issued. It doesn't set out a time limit for when those works have to be completed within the typical format of a development permit.
And is that legislative, or is that mandatory, or can you make it a year?
Maybe directed to Grant. You're asking if can a development permit restrict the length of time, say, it could be active for?
Mm-hmm.
the Local Government Act sets out what we can do in development permits. And it varies from type of development permit area to other types. So for example, if we have a development permit area that has to do with the protection of the environment, and we know that certain works affect fish or bird populations at certain times of year, we can, with development permits that are meant to protect the environment, we can impose timing restrictions so that works don't occur during sensitive times of year. Bear in mind, what we're most often working with here are geohazard development permit areas. And unless there's a clear, unless it's clear to us that works occurring during a certain time of year, for example, during peak rainy periods or something, are present a higher level of risk or a unique risk. If that was the case, then I do believe we probably could impose timing requirements, but we can't impose timing requirements that are meant to reduce the duration of community impacts from trucking, for example, or from dust from soil deposit, or because we want the works to occur over 3 months instead of slowly over 5 years. We don't have that kind of discretion.
Okay, and one other question, just for my own knowledge. How easy is it to renew a development permit? What's the process? Thank you.
Through the chair, Director Warrenberg. So development permits aren't renewed the same way as a temporary use permit. So as Graham's stating, once the development permit's been issued, it's been issued and those works can occur. So there's no requirement to renew it unless, say, the person hadn't started construction within that 2-year time period. Then they would have to reapply for a new development permit. And it would be the same criteria as long as that development permit was meeting the guidelines in the development permit area, then the development permit would be issued.
Just follow up if I could. So if there's new restrictions or regulations in that time, then a renewal would have to follow the new restrictions or regulations?
Get through the chair to the Director Warrenberg. So if the development permit guidelines had changed and they were in place at the time of the new application, they would have to meet whichever guidelines were listed within the development permit area guidelines.
Thank you.
Good, thank you, Director Wardenberg. Director Davidson. You're muted, Davidson. There we go.
Sorry about that. Yeah, a couple things. One on the development permit, thinking about, and the comments about staff resources and essentially we don't inspect the work. Thinking about where we are today and what's changed from where we were in the past. Again, the reminder that right now there is great financial incentive in being excessive in terms of, you get a development permit that says, yeah, you're good to bring in 100,000 cubic meters. Somebody can bring in 200,000 cubic meters and, we tell the public, well, they got a development permit, they're good to go. So what can you do? But without some sort of monitoring on this, there's in my mind, an unmitigated risk of excess. And I think it might be worthwhile considering or reconsidering our approach to monitoring these things. I think this also relates to potential future soil deposit bylaw. Same thing applies. We may need to consider inspections. I wonder if staff have any thoughts on that. I have other questions as well.
Mr. Downs.
Thank you, Chair. Development permit areas are really not intended or designed as tools to regulate soil deposit. It's really only incidental. In other words, they address the geohazard risk associated with soil deposit. And so the quantity of material deposited is really an ancillary issue, except insofar as it affects, the transfer of risk to adjacent properties. So we certainly are interested if a proponent gives us a plan that involves the deposit, a fill area, and which they tell us is 50,000 cubic meters. If their plans material change, then they need to come back to us and we need to look at an amendment to the development permit. There wouldn't be any barrier to depositing more fill. It's just they would need either a new development permit, or we need to amend an existing permit to reflect their new design to include more material, if you follow me. And that might mean they have to go back to their engineer and get some new assurances. But it wouldn't ultimately prevent people from depositing more materials, more soil than they originally planned. Now that would be different, say, for a riparian development permit area, which is meant to protect the stream corridor. If they expand the area that they're depositing soil in, within 30 meters of a stream, then that would be prohibited unless they get a qualified environmental professional to confirm that that's fine and it meets the provincial requirements. So in some ways, I think we're really trying to apply, because we don't have a soil deposit bylaw that truly regulates the quantity of material and how that material gets deposited. We're really trying to stretch the use of tools that weren't meant to do that, and it's not a natural fit. But none of that is to say that staff can't be more active in monitoring, I think, within limits, the works that are occurring under development permits. The system that we have right now really relies on professionals, and so the professional that does the hazard assessment needs to give us the formal assurance that they're going to do field inspections, go out and monitor the works. We don't tell them the frequency of monitoring, that's up to them. And that when the construction's done, they'll submit a post-construction report that identifies any deviance from the plan or the design. And it's really, we're really oriented to this professional reliance on professionals rather than staff going out and making sure that the fill pad and the riprap being placed is to the specifications of the engineer. But that said, when we get complaints, we do go out. We look to see that to our eye, the works are matching the works that are designed. And if we don't think there are, we take up the issue. But we don't proactively say week to week or every 2 weeks, drive around to these sites, because these are planning land use approvals. We're not staffed up to do that kind of work. That doesn't mean we can't step up in modest ways. It of course takes us away from other work, but we'd look for your advice and direction there if that's something you're looking for us to do. If it is, we could come back to you and give you a little bit more information about what it might mean for other areas and take your guidance.
I think that's totally fine. I think I misunderstood. As long as in the process there's something in there which requires some oversight of the finished work. Doesn't have to be by FERD staff, but as long as that's in there, the registered professional is going to monitor compliance at some point. Then I think it's as good as we can hope for at this point. I did have some other comments, having looked closely at the report and the proposed framework. One thing I noticed in the report is that under technical assessments, it says the ALC lacks in-house expertise to assess technical reports, such as engineering or drainage plans, and relies on local governments to identify potential concerns with reports submitted at the time of application. And then when we look at what our recommended approach is, for example, if we have concerns with what's the right word, cumulative floodplain effects, which I thought was a great bullet, and also impact on neighboring properties, if our sort of proposed default recommendation is to refer that back to the ALC with comments, but ALC doesn't have expertise, I'm thinking I'm seeing a contradiction, and I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Through the chair to Director Davidson. So in our conversations with the ALC, they identified that they don't necessarily have the capacity in their staff to have professional engineers on staff. They would rely on this professional reliance model. It's kind of like we're talking about with development permits. So the idea would be that the ALC takes an application as it is, and we provide our comments back. And if we think they should be requesting things like a lot grading plan or reports on soil quantity, these are things we could identify back to the ALC. And as the ALC is the receiver of these actual applications, they could go back to the applicant as the authority to approve these applications and ask for these further requirements. So it wouldn't be the regional district asking for these items. They would be coming from the ALC directly back to the applicant. But what we have also heard from the ALC is that where there have been concerns identified and gaps in technical reporting, that the ALC doesn't often ask for further submissions from their applicants. So they take the applications that are at hand and consider them. And if gaps had been identified, that may influence the decision that's made by the panel. And applicants would be then re-invited back to submit revised applications with further technical reporting. So the reliance goes back to the professionals who are writing those reports. So it's through our legal review that we've had, it would be outside the FPRD's authority or the review of these application space from a land use perspective to be asking for specific technical reporting. But the way to go around that would be making those recommendations to the ALC and having them either request them or denying the application because there is missing information and having them come back with professionals.
So, okay, what I'm hearing then is that, for example, using the Hartley Road referral we had a couple of months back, we sent it back with requests for them to, ensure no impact on neighborhood properties. ALC would look at that concern and say, yeah, it hasn't been addressed. We're not going to ask the applicant to submit a further report. We will presumably advise that the committee, or sorry, that the application be denied on that basis, invite the applicant to resubmit. We get another, goes through a referral process again, comes back to us, and we carry on, and hopefully it's addressing the neighborhood property concern. But I guess I'm wondering is that if we're relying on the ALC to do that, and this comes down to their lack of in-house expertise. So, even if they had a technical report in front of them, they wouldn't know what to do with it and need to refer it back over to us to see if we have concerns. Rather than refer it back to the ALC, why not simply just deny the referral?
And that could be a decision made by the board. The board could make a decision not to forward that application to the ALC because there's too many gaps in the technical reporting. But the ALC, just like staff at the regional district, have to have a reliance on the professionals writing the reports, that the reports have been written in a professional manner and that all of the criteria they've done to evaluate the proposal has been done and is okay within their professional opinion.
But you just said that in the report says the ALC lacks that expertise to assess these reports, and that their only recourse is basically to invite the applicant to reapply, so that the second time around the applicant does have the right technical report, which makes it to us, and we look at it and say whether we're okay or not. So I'm just trying to understand what the benefit of us is of us referring this back to ALC with these comments when we see these things that raise technical concerns, as opposed to just refusing to refer it back.
Right, and that could be the consideration by the board. The board could decide that at that time, because there are these gaps, that we're not referring it back to the ALC for a decision. We're deciding not to forward it because there are too many gaps in the technical reporting.
Okay, so we're looking, I'm sorry.
Sorry, it still wouldn't prevent the applicant. So if the FPRD board decided not to forward the application to ALC for consideration, my understanding is that the applicant could still reapply with more information, and that new application would come back to the FPRD for further consideration.
Right, so I'm just saying is, why should our recommended approach be, rather than refer it back to the ALC with comments, why is our recommended approach not to simply deny? It seems simpler and more, anyway, I'm just not following why we would refer it back to ALC, knowing they can't do anything with those comments other than deny the application anyway, based on those comments.
Okay, I think we get to your point, Director Davidson. Maybe we'll let staff comment final time, and then we'll move on.
I do have another question as well.
You jump in here, Chair. Yeah, I think the staff view is consistent with the views that Director Davidson's expressing, and it's that where the board sees significant gaps, you're uncertain what a fill deposit might mean more broadly for the floodplain, difficult to assess in the context of an individual site, or you feel like there are significant technical gaps in the material, then I agree with the idea that the board may simply choose not to forward those along. On the other hand, there might be relatively modest proposals that you're fundamentally not uncomfortable with, but you do think there might be some technical gaps. In that case, you might choose to forward those more minor fill proposals on with a comment to the ALC that the ALC ought to require professional monitoring and post-construction reporting. And that's something that the ALC can do, and they do it relatively routinely for all but minor deposit applications. So I think there's some latitude there about how the board may wish to treat those relatively modest applications, and perhaps that's something we could take our framework back and flesh that out a little bit to more clearly reflect the comments that Director Davidson made. They really do align with the staff view of it, and I think we can be more clear on that in the framework document.
Okay. Thank you. Like, I was just going to say, I do have one other question.
Yep.
I'm totally on side with not requesting technical reports. I would observe that when we get into soil deposit bylaw land, that may need to change, but that's another time. Just one question I have, it uses as a as a criteria to not refer back if the soil deposit, if the amount of fill is significant. And I was troubled by the kind of lack of certainty around that criteria. I mean, how do we determine what constitutes significant? What does that even look like? And I'm wondering if staff have thoughts on that.
Through the chair to Director Davidson, I think the use of significant, and maybe to step back a bit, is providing these 3 recommended options allows for discretion. So it doesn't say that on every application, staff have to recommend on significant area-wide deposits not to forward. It's that we could choose to forward all of them with our concerns highlighted every time. We don't have to automatically choose not to forward it, but that allows for that discretion. And when we're talking about significant, it's really subjective. So staff would review an application, determine how much of the property is placing fill on it, look at how many trucks that is, and they would make a decision on what their recommendation would be on that application. So I can't tell you a definitive number if that's 10,000 cubic meters or it's 50,000 cubic meters, but staff would have to be looking at what the soil was being deposited for, if it is for an agricultural purposes, and considering those aspects of the application in their staff recommendation. That's not to say that staff recommendation doesn't have alternative options when it comes to the board for consideration. So even if the staff recommendation for an area-wide fill deposit was to forward it with comments to the ALC, there would be options in the staff report that the board could choose not to forward it.
Okay, thank you. It would seem that some discretion needs to be applied in these cases, and each application is different, and we rely on our good staff to make those decisions. We will move on to Director Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I'm not sure. So does this apply to individual homes that have just been bringing in, or like, well, I mean, some of you are probably aware of one in my area, but like, does it apply to the individual homes that just have been bringing in piles, truckload of soil or material, and now has potentially created problems? Like, I'm just kind of wondering where the individual person that wanted to bring in a bunch of material, would that person be applying for a development permit? Like, how does it work?
Yeah, so through the chair to Director Dixon. So in terms of a development permit, so if the property is located within a development permit area, the placement of fill would be considered land alteration. So our most common development permits are for geohazards or for riparian areas. So if that fill was being deposited or that land alteration was occurring within 30 meters, the property owner would be responsible for applying for a development permit for riparian areas, which would be accompanied by a riparian areas assessment done by a qualified environmental professional. If it wasn't a geohazard DP, then they would need to submit a development permit application for the land alteration with a geohazard report. But any properties that are depositing soil right now, that are outside the ALR or outside any of our development permit areas, there's currently no regulations to regulate the fill on those properties.
So will that possibly be addressed in a soil deposit bylaw at some point?
So currently the framework highlights what we can do, but the soil deposit would be something that could be applied to every electoral area within the regional district. That would be the decision of the board of where that bylaw would apply and what it would regulate.
Okay, thank you.
Good, thank you, Director Dixon. So it appears we're getting a framework in place, and in the period before we get a soil bylaw in place, which any guesses on how many years that might take?
Yes, Director Dickey, less than a year, certainly. If I think the concept that we share is to develop a soil deposit bylaw that avoids the concurrent authority with the Ministry of Environment and therefore doesn't need provincial approval. So it's a soil deposit bylaw that the board could adopt in one meeting, for example. And I'd suggest that once we have the budget confirmed for it, hopefully at the end of February, that we're looking at a period of 3 or 4 months of bylaw development and dialogue. And then there's recruitment and a few other things in that period. And so I think that by into the third quarter of next year, we ought to, that's a realistic timeline for having a functioning bylaw.
Good, good. Thank you, Mr. Donalus. Director Kaus.
I'd like to move the recommendation.
Thank you. We got a seconder, Director Dixon. Any further discussion? Hearing, Director
Davidson. Sorry, Chair, did you recognize me? I didn't hear.
I did, yes.
Thank you. So during our earlier discussion, we talked about Mr. Daniels referred to potentially reworking things to reflect some of the comments. I don't know if I have that right, so I guess I'm wondering if we need a refer back to staff for that to happen. I guess my question is through to Mr. Daniels. Do you see a need to rework the framework as presented based on everything that we've discussed today?
Mr. Daniels, please.
Thank you, Chair. What my preference would be with your forbearance is that we have until tomorrow to submit our items for the board agenda. We'll make what I think are modest tweaks to the framework and continue to the board if that meets your expectations. And I see those changes being the one we discussed around sort of these smaller fill proposals with incomplete information and how we balance it. And the second would be greater clarity, perhaps through examples of what, relatively minor fill looks like. And providing it may be possible for us to provide some quantity parameters, but I think we could also provide descriptions that make it evident. So those are little changes, and if we can make them tomorrow, then with your agreement, we'll just bring it right to the board.
Sounds good to me. I don't know if we need to change the motion before us to reflect that.
What would the staff preference be?
I think we can just take that as direction.
Okay, good. Thank you. On the motion, all those in favor, contrary, motion carries. Thank you, Ms. Antifeoff, for a very nice presentation. Obviously, you know this file well. Ms. Kinner.
Thank you. Item 9.2 is a temporary use permit application for the storage of recreational vehicles at 38482 Bell Road in Electoral Area G.
And I'd like to move their staff recommendation.
Director Castle, second Director Adamo, discussion Director Castle.
Yes, thank you. And I agree with the staff recommendation that a temporary use permit that requires a long-term permanent alteration to the property probably is not a wise way to move forward. I do appreciate the work that went into this report. As I alluded to in the last item, these reports are already being used by residents to understand what the regulatory powers of the FVRD are. I especially appreciate the comments with regards to our lack of authority without a soil deposit bylaw. And I can tell you that I'm very happy to be able to report to residents that We have started that work because as these reports have become public, there are members of the public that are quite concerned that these large scale deposits are able to proceed without regulation. So thank you for this report, and that's my comments.
Good, thank you, Director Castle. Seeing no further discussion, all in favor, contrary, motion carries.
9.3 is major official community plan and zoning amendments to facilitate the redevelopment of 52285, 52375, 52425, and 52445 Yale Road in Electoral Area D into a residential subdivision with commercial and multifamily land uses.
Motion, Director Dixon, second, Director Makahonic. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, contrary, motion carries.
9.4 is covenants relating to the subdivision of land at 41523 Nacomin Island Trunk Road in Electoral Area G.
To Director Castle, second, Director Wardenberg. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, contrary, motion carries.
9.5 is development variance permit 2025-01 to reduce setbacks at 46090 Lougheed Highway in Electoral Area C.
Motion, Director Wardenberg, second, Director Dixon. Any discussion, Director Wardenberg?
Just want to thank staff for expediting this file as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Director Wardenberg. All those in favor, contrary, motion carries.
Item 9.6 is Steward Logistics Inc. Towers Telecommunications Tower Referral at 53294 Yale Road in Electoral Area D.
Motion, Director Dixon, second, Director Adamo. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor, contrary, motion carries.
9.7 is temporary changes to liquor licensing at Sasquatch Inn in Electoral Area C.
Director Wardenberg enthusiastically moves the second, Director Castle. And Director Castle discussion.
Thank you, Chair Dickey. Just a question through to staff with regards to 9.7 and 9.8. Third time since I've been on the board that this temporary changes to the liquor licensing at Sasquatch has come across this table. My question is just with regards to do these items, is it required that they come to the board, or can these be decisioned by staff? And I'm speaking about 9.7 and 9.8.
They are currently, I'll say currently required to come to the board, although if it's your interest, we could explore whether there's an opportunity to delegate these matters to be handled at a staff level.
I know that for, with regards to 9.7, it appears that this is an annual thing that really doesn't need to come all the way through. I know with 9.8, in business matters, if we can streamline a process to allow business to happen quicker, I'm all in favor of that. So I don't know what next steps might be, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Okay, thank you, Director Castle. So staff may take a look at this and see whether we could streamline the process.
I think perhaps a motion from the committee would be helpful if you wanted to direct us to prepare a report to that effect.
And I'd be happy to make that motion after we vote on this one.
Yeah. All those in favor, contrary, motion carries. Director Castle.
Thank you. So I guess I'd like to move that we ask staff to prepare a report that will advise us on whether or not we can streamline processes for changes to liquor licenses. And I know it seems a bit counterintuitive to ask for staff to do less work, but if we can do a little bit of work now, it might save us more work in the future. Work.
Thank you, Director Castle. Second, Director Wardenberg. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor, contrary, motion carries.
9.8 is lounge area endorsement liquor license application for Chestnut Springs Cidery, 1331 Janovic Road in Electoral Area H.
Director Dixon, second, Director Castle. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor, contrary, motion carries.
9.9 is an information item. It's the preliminary interpretation of a large landside complex at Boston Bar.
Any discussion? Hearing none, we shall move forward.
9.10 is also an information item. It's development permits issued in 2024 by the Director of Planning and Development.
Discussion? Hearing none, we will move forward again.
10.1.1 is proposed earthquake early warning station at the Chilliwack River Volunteer Fire Hall.
Move Director McElhonick, second Director Adamo. Any discussion? Director McElhonick.
I think this is a great idea, and it's going to be put out there and not in anybody's way, and it's a great public service that we can do. So thank you to staff.
Good. Thank you. All those in favor, contrary, motion carries.
10.2.1 is evacuation route guide, electoral area E, again, an information item.
Director Castle.
I just want to make the comment that I love reading these guides. I learned so much about electoral area E, and I think they're just exactly what they're intended to be, a wealth of information and a fantastic resource. So yeah, this great work. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Castle, Director Wardenberg, and then McElhonick.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Director Castle. I read the whole thing. It's very, very informative. I do know that we have an evacuation guide coming up for Hemlock Valley, and I just had a question as far as what boundaries would be involved in that guide, if you would know that at this point. Like, how far reaching would that report be?
Thank you. It's a great question, and I appreciate that you asked it. We'll be focusing on the village itself. We have a finite grant, of course, to fund this work and to pull the future body of evacuation route guides together under an umbrella. We're doing both the Hemlock evacuation route guide in addition to a master overview that will assemble some of the generalized information about what evacuees are, where people might go, how to be prepared for evacuations, and what the examples of our templates are. So we'll be looking somewhat at the census boundary that we defined within the community profile page in the emergency management plan. We'll include the route down, but we won't necessarily map the route because it's Crown land and FSR. And so there are very few routes out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Director Wardenberg, Director McElhonick.
Yes, I think it's really well done, and the residents are going to really love it, I'm sure. I was told there's going to be a link. It's going to be put on our website. I'm kind of holding off on my director's report. Do you know when that will be accessible? And if somebody could let me know as soon as we do, then I can put it into my report, so I'm not sending out numerous things. But really well done, and I think people will feel really well supported in the valley. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just as eager to support your eagerness in getting that out to our public. So I've already given Ms. Piper a heads up that this will be likely coming her way for quick publication on our website and some social media push around it. So I would say give us a few days, maybe mid to late next week, and then we'll have it ready to go for you on our EM landing page with some other ability to push out.
If I could just clarify, we really probably should wait until after the board meeting. So it's introduced at the board meeting at February 26th, and then we can put it onto our website in the appropriate location.
Thank you.
That actually gives me more time because I'm going to be going away too. So thank you.
Good. Thank you, Director McElhonick, and we will move forward.
Thank you. So moving to 11.1 is the 2025 advocacy and LMLGA resolutions.
Looking for a motion. Move Director McElhonick, second Director Adamo, Director Castle.
Yes, Chair Dickey. I request that we sever the motion and debate the second or the and that FERD board directs staff to further develop an advocacy plan, that we debate that separately, please.
So we need a seconder to that motion.
We actually, Chair Dickey, we don't need that. That is in order. So what I would recommend is that you consider the first part of the motion, the first paragraph and the resolutions that accompany it, and you could have the debate on that item and vote on it, and then move on to the second part as Director Castle has divided.
So we need a seconder for that motion.
We don't need a seconder. I think we've got a mover and a seconder for
we've
the
already
main
got-
motion. So
okay.
yeah.
Good.
Just a point of order, Chair.
Director Davidson.
I did submit a further amendment to it. I'm just curious, at what point am I able to introduce that amendment to this motion?
Right. Director Davidson, thank you.
Yes, through the chair to Director Davidson, we always appreciate getting the heads up. So since this motion has been moved, and I believe that your amendment that you would like to bring forward would be in order in connection with the first part, which is going to be discussed right now. So you could move an amendment at this time.
At which point I would like to do so. The amendment as submitted to staff.
And we can just bring it right up on the screen if that's helpful.
Okay. Just give directors a moment to read the motion and
Perhaps Director Davidson, did you want to read it aloud? It is a little bit small on our screen, and I know that you probably have it there in front of you.
Sure, I certainly can. Just that, excuse me, that the Fraser Valley Regional District Board directs staff to forward 3 resolutions to the Lower Mainland Local Government Association, LMLGA, for consideration at its annual general meeting, AGM, and conference from April 29th to May 1st, 2025. Resolution number 3, enhance enforcement measures and address public safety risks related to illegal fill dumping. Whereas ongoing illegal fill dumping activities in the FERD violate both bylaws and the Agricultural Land Commission Act. Despite the issuance of stop work orders by the Agricultural Land Commission, ALC, and the FERD, these activities persist due to ineffective current enforcement frameworks. Financial penalties are time-consuming to apply, require extensive staff resources, do not recoup costs, and fail to guarantee compliance. Whereas illegal dumping poses significant environmental risks, threatening agricultural productivity and local ecosystems, and has led to significant public safety risks as local residents facing ineffective ALC and FERD responses constrained by current provincial legislation resort to physically blocking such activities themselves. Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy conservation officers have demonstrated effective enforcement by immediately seizing equipment such as vehicles and boats involved in illegal hunting and fishing activities, offering a model for other areas of law and bylaw enforcement. Therefore, be it resolved that the Union of British Columbia Municipalities, UBCM, petitioned the provincial government to provide local governments, the ALC, and other relevant provincial agencies the authority to immediately seize equipment such as excavators, dump trucks, and bulldozers involved in illegal fill dumping activities. And be it further resolved that the UBCM advocate for streamlining the financial penalty process to make it more efficient and capable of recouping enforcement costs, while also ensuring penalties serve as effective deterrents to illegal dumping.
okay, so we have that added onto the original motion.
So you'll need a seconder, Chair Dickey, for that amendment.
And the seconder, Director Johnson. Discussion, Director Dixon.
I have a question. So there's parts of this third resolution that's been introduced that I can support, but there's parts that I'm not particularly supportive of, I guess, and something I'd like to maybe add to it. But are we voting on these as a block, or are we voting on these one resolution at a time?
Through the chair to Director Dixon, has been introduced as an amendment, so it's added on to the 2 that are already there, and the motion is to submit 3 resolutions to LMLGA. So you'd be voting on all 3 at once. If the amendment passes, if the amendment passes.
And if I wanted to separate this one to do individually, is there a process for that?
Well, first you're voting on the amendment of whether you even want to add this.
So we're
Okay.
talking about the third resolution that Director Davidson's brought forward right now.
All right, so we're voting to add it in.
Mm-hmm. So Director Davidson's finished. Director Castle.
Thank you. So if I understand correctly, if the amendment passes, then we can ask to separate them, the resolutions. That's a little clunky, it seems to me. And I wonder if Director Davidson would consider removing his amendment and reintroducing this as a separate motion.
Through the chair to Director Castle, and I'm going to give you an answer, and then I will look to our corporate officer to comment. I don't think that you would, first of all, in order to divide those, you would have to seek a vote on that one, because I would argue that these are not separate topics. When you separate the clauses, the individual clauses need to be able to stand on their own and of their own merit. A single resolution doesn't really stand on its own, in this case. So an alternative would be to, if that was the desire, I suppose, would be that it would be submitted as a separate motion as opposed to tying it to the first two. But it was introduced as an amendment, so
Okay, well,
deal with that first.
I'm unable to support the amendment. My reason for separating the motion originally was because I didn't want the original two resolutions to get held up by objections to the second part. So unfortunately, this amendment would mean that I wouldn't be able to support the motion in its entirety. And my reasons for not supporting the amendment, I believe that this amendment completely contradicts what's laid out in the staff report. I'm completely uncomfortable moving forward with a resolution to LMLGA or UBCM that hasn't been properly researched, that we actually don't even have can we define illegal fill? In the FVRD, we don't have a soil deposit bylaw, so I'm totally unable to support the amendment.
Okay, thank you, Director Castle. Further discussion, Director Davidson.
So thank you, Chair. So if we're speaking to the amendment and the staff report, when I looked at the staff report, a few points were being made. One, that there's no soil bylaw, but FVRD has stopped work orders on around building permit and development permit violations that are being violated today. And bear in mind that this amendment is about legislative changes. So on the staff comments on requirement or no meaningful consultation, when you consider UBCM motions and the resolutions that go before UBCM, I'm certainly unaware of any requirement to consult. And as we're talking about, at least by the FVRD, and if you're looking at legislative changes, the requirement to consult would be at the provincial level, not at ours, because this authority lies in provincial legislation. The other thing is when we're talking about financial impacts of this, this is an ask for authority. It's not, if we do get authority by whatever means, whether or not we exercise it is a completely different matter. And that in my mind speaks to cost. CBC did a piece on illegal fill quite recently. And what was troubling for me when it comes to provincial engagement on this was that Minister Popham declined to be interviewed, but commented that penalties had been increased in 2019. We met with then Minister Alexis in UBCM last year, and certainly don't see any signs of movement. There's time delay. We do nothing now. The only thing we might get is another ministerial meeting at UBCM. It'd be a different story if we were seeing some movement from the province on this topic, but to date we've seen nothing. The current situation is an unresolved public safety issue. We had more illegal fill just prior to Christmas. I'd reached out to ALC enforcement at that time and was told that it would be 3 weeks later before ALC could get an inspector on site. So to me, this speaks to the public safety side of it and the need to move on it. And I would also say too that without this consultation and if, in my mind, I've seen resolutions at UBCM that had considerably less thought put into it. But it works out that this is simply crazy. We do have until UBCM to withdraw the motion. We don't have to go forward with it. Moving forward to LMLGA today is not a requirement that we bring it to UBCM. We can withdraw it, but if we don't do it, then we've done nothing for yet another year, and that to me concerns me greatly. So that's why I support the amendment. It may well be that Director Castle would prefer to see this separated, but he was speaking to the content as opposed to the process on this one. So I felt I do need to reply in kind. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Director Davidson. Director Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I see this as a changing legislation to empower the province to halt these drivers and these operators of their equipment and to stop what's been going on for 3 years or more. Yeah, so I fully support this. If we can get the province to put a halt to by impounding or confiscating their equipment, then that's pretty much going to eliminate further need from the FERD.
Okay. Thank you, Director Johnson. Director Castle.
Thank you. And I just want to apologize. I realize after Director Davidson's comments that I should not have been speaking on the content, but only on the amendment itself. And I just want to add that it's not that I'm not in favor of this concept. I just don't believe that it's ready to be forwarded. Quite frankly, anything that comes up on the screen that looks and sounds like what this resolution does that hasn't been vetted and presented through our professional staff makes me extremely uncomfortable.
Thank you, Director Castle. Director Damo.
Thanks very much. I tend to agree with Director Castle, and I have a bit of problems with the wording where we start creating an issue that I'm not comfortable with, where we basically accuse ALC and FERD as ineffective in their roles. I don't think that's an appropriate way to place that information out to UBCM or LGMA. I don't think that's appropriate at all. So I would want to strike that at the very least. In terms of the actual portion of the motion asking for more and better enforceable regulations, I mean, nobody can really deny that request. So I'm not certain that we are anywhere near ready to present this motion. That's just my thoughts. Thank you.
Okay. So on the amendment, which is to include resolution 3, all those in favor? We've got 1. On all those contrary to the motion, 2, 3, 4, 5, the motion fails.
So back to the main motion,
Which is
the
the
two
first 2
resolutions. That's right.
resolutions. Okay. Any discussion on the other 2 resolutions? Hearing none. All those in favor? Contrary? Motion carries.
So then what we will do is we will go back to the divided part of the motion, which is with respect to the advocacy plan that Director Castle divided.
Okay, and do we need a separate motion for this?
You will need a motion to move that portion if that's what's being the intention is.
Okay, we are not getting a motion. No one is indicating that they are in favor of that motion. which is to develop an advocacy plan following 14 issues in 2025. Move Director Macahonix.
I wasn't gonna move that.
We need a seconder.
Davidson.
Davidson seconds. On the motion, discussion. Director Dixon.
Well, what I was going to ask was if we did not move this, then we would not be asking staff to work on a plan that we could have 14 issues for them to take care of. Um, uh, so I do not support this. I think that, we constantly hear how overworked our staff are, and we try to focus on a work plan and on our strategic plan. And now we have 14 other issues that we want them to find out information of, possibly 15. And we're only in February. And so I understand that sometimes things come up and we have to have an ability to find out information about it. I don't know that we need every single thing to be on the advocacy plan, and there has to be a better way that's far more efficient than asking our staff to do a whole bunch of extra work on things that perhaps really don't need a lot of extra work. It could be something like set a meeting with the minister. Those are just my comments.
Good. Thank you, Director Dixon. Maybe for those who were not present this morning at the RACS meeting, be aware that this motion did come forward there, and it was unanimously supported other than Director Castle. Staff, am I right about that?
Yes, Chidiki, that's correct. And if I can just sort of put a framework around that a little bit. So in terms of advocacy plan, this process of having 2 advocacy committees has provided some structure for the first time that I can remember at this organization around all of the advocacy items that come forward at our various tables. I think it's been a very useful exercise in that regard, because often we have these long lists of things that require advocacy, and some, as you've mentioned, may only require a letter. Some may require a request for a meeting. Some of them staff would recommend we continue to monitor. For example, when board members put forward resolutions to UBCM and we get a response, and often that response is less than satisfactory, we haven't really ever had a mechanism for continuing to follow that item. So in terms of what is being presented before you from the staff perspective, would simply be capturing these items and having regular ongoing conversation about them. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're having to put in a super amount of effort on each of them equally. However, it's the recognition that there are 14 items, which is rather extraordinary for an organization of this size. So it does help us to capture them. At this point in time, I can't say that I'm extremely concerned about the workload. I did want to mention, though, just on the item around seizing equipment, the recommendation from staff was to continue to research that one and vet that out a little bit further, particularly with respect to the local government piece of that. So the consultation part wasn't really meant to imply that we needed to consult in order to bring something forward to UBCM, but just to really understand if that providing that tool was actually going to be desired. We've had instances in the past where we've gone to UBCM requesting that the province add additional resources to certain areas. Those requests have actually been met with a terse no thank you, stay in your lane, mind your own business. We don't actually want that extra authority. So we're just trying to make sure that we're building the most credible resolutions to go forward that have the highest degree of success, so that when you get your one kick at the can at that resolution, that you're putting one forward that has a really good case behind it. So in terms of the framework, I don't have any concerns at this time per se, but just at least we all have an awareness of just how many items we're tracking and following and working on.
Good. Thank you, Ms. Kinnaman. On the motion discussion, Director Macahonix.
Thank you. And I just wanted to follow up on my comments and my understanding of what was talked about at the RACS meeting. And I mean, my understanding with the advocacy committee is that however many items there are, I mean, it's to track them. And I recall Ms. Kinnaman talking about how it's great to have a spreadsheet and you have everything in there and to track them. And I think it's really important. And you put a lot of them in the parking lot, that they're there and you kind of know it. And, you know, we want to be, I think, as a board, very much future forward thinking. And for things like, I mean, I think if we would have had an advocacy committee maybe years ago and tracking different issues, we might not have this situation where we have that we have today with the sewage, where everyone was caught by surprise and there's no room for it, and it's causing issues and it's a great expense. So I think, you know, that's just one issue. I think that there's others as well. And with climate events and changing political climate, I think that it's really important that we track those, because sometimes we might have to move a lot more quickly than we had planned. And then sometimes they'll change and they'll become a non-issue. But if we track them and we have them, you know, it's much easier to deal with what you know and what you can see than having these kind of crop up by surprise. So I do support this, and I think it's future forward thinking. And I really like when you can track and keep track of things in an organized way and kind of look back and see, because we can't look back and see how did it get missed on the sewage and where we're at today, and how much costs, not just of dollars, but of our time. And it's going to continue to do so. So I will support this, and I'm quite comfortable after the discussion at RACS that our CAO is quite comfortable in approaching our chair if she thinks there's a workload issue on any of it. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Director Makahonic. Director Castle.
Thank you, Chair Dickey. And you know what, my reason for separating these was exactly that, so that we could have this discussion and really have a check-in. When I opened up this report, that I might say the advocacy meetings were in January, and this very well done report lands on our agenda, and quite frankly, I'm not even trying to imply that all of these aren't important, but even for me, since we got this agenda package, to be able to really think through and understand all of these items, it's overwhelming. And while I agree that tracking issues is good practice, the recommendation is that direct staff to further develop an advocacy plan. It doesn't say to me that we've done the work and we're just going to track. It says now that we're going to ask staff to develop a plan for each of these. And while members of RACS did indicate that at the advocacy committee meetings there were conversations with staff around workload and capacity. Yeah, it's great for staff to tell us that they've got capacity to do the work, but I know when my boss asks me if I have capacity to do the work that they've given me to do, I'm not ought to say no, right? And I also know that by not saying no, it leads to burnout. And the last thing that I want to do is to create a whole bunch of work and ask staff to track or monitor or set up meetings for us that takes our eyes off the ball. And the ball for us is the core services that we provide, that our residents pay for us to provide. My question at RACS was also around, what service area does advocacy fall under? You know, there are senior staff members who are tracking some of these issues off the side of their desk. Well, in my mind, that's a distraction. And I also wonder on some of these, is it up to an elected representative to track the issue, up to the elected representative to reach out to the minister for a meeting, which I believe we've all done successfully at different times, as opposed to a meeting at UBCM, which I haven't seen any fruit from. So again, it's just was really important for me that we have this conversation, that we have this check-in with each other, that this is actually unfunded, unplanned work that we want our staff spending time on.
Good. Thank you, Director Castle. Director Wardenberg.
Yeah, I am good with this as far as moving forward, only because of staff's comments as far as the workload goes. They seem comfortable at this point in time with these 14 advocacy items. My worry would be if any more. These came out of 2 meetings a month ago. So this is my concern, would be how many more comes up as the advocacy committees meet again. And I would just be very cognizant of this decisions coming out of those committees. And I can't foresee the future of what will come out of there, but I think 14 is enough for the year, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Wardenberg. Director Davidson.
Thank you. So speaking in support of the motion, to Director Castle's comments, I would observe that if we're to affect change external to this organization, our only route is advocacy. And in that context, I think advocacy absolutely is a core service. Otherwise we have no voice. And if there's a substantial amount of pieces out there, 14, 20, 30, whatever it is, absolutely you need a plan to manage it. And such a plan could, if the volume becomes excessive, then it would look to staff to start saying, hey, this is excessive. Either got to prioritize this stuff or need more resources. But we have staff's comment already. So like with any endeavor, you come up with a plan to suit the size of the endeavor, and yeah, I'm totally supporting having a plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Davidson. Director Castle.
Thank you. And I completely agree that in order to affect change, we need to engage in advocacy. And I believe that the funding that pays for that advocacy is in director salaries. And I'm happy to go out and do my work as a director of this board to affect change outside of the board. And I don't believe that the taxpayers expect that we're asking our staff to do that work for us. And around Director Wardenberg's comments, I did make a comment at RACS. I would love it if the advocacy committees could have a discussion around a policy about how we handle it. I'm heartened to hear the CAO say that she's happy that we now have some structure to this. Maybe we could add a little more structure on it just to ensure that we don't fill our structure so full that it bursts and we have an issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Director Castle. We'll allow Director Davidson for a final comment.
Thank you, Chair. So looking at that resolution that failed, I'm thinking, the staff identified the need to do further research, and if that research is to be done by myself, I'm not sure what further research I can do other than what I've already presented. So absolutely, if research is warranted, then we need resources to do that research. Anyway, but thank you.
Good. Thank you, Director Davidson. So the motion, as I understand it, is that the Fraser Valley Regional District Board directs staff to further develop an advocacy plan following 14 issues in 2025. All those in favor? Contrary? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you. So moving down to item 13.1, which is an information item. It's the quarterly report for the fourth quarter of 2024. Just some stats and figures about all of the things that went on around the Fraser Valley Regional District. Happy to take any questions on that item.
Seeing none, we will move forward.
Davidson?
No, pardon me, Director Davidson.
Sorry, just let me bring up my notes here. On the bylaw section, on the report. I guess my question is, when you're referring to active files, are you referring to files that staff are currently working on, or are you referring to basically files where there's an ongoing compliance issue? I'm trying to understand if this includes, for example, files where where the board has put a notice on title but is not doing any further action, or does that number of active files include such properties?
I'll just look to staff through the chair to Director Davidson. I've always interpreted that to be open files, but excellent clarification of what open means.
Thank you. Through the chair, that number is our total number of files that are active, and it would include instances where the board has authorized the notice to title. The notice to title, of course, doesn't make the contravention go away, and we continue to work with owners, albeit often at a very low intensity level, but we continue to work towards compliance. So they are included in that total.
Thank you. So I just have one request for future iterations of the report, is to include a change, like what has changed in that number since the previous report. So we can see if we're winning or losing the game, in other words, would be my request. Do we need a motion?
Staff would take that into consideration, or would like a motion?
We'll take that as direction. Thank you.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you, Director Davidson. That is for information only, so I'll turn things back to Ms. Kidman.
So item 15 is reports by electoral area directors.
Director Castle.
Thank you, Chair Dickey. I was pleased to attend a community forum hosted by BC Transit and Lecamus First Nation regarding the proposed bus route from Agassiz to Mission along Route 7. It was great to see approximately 50 people in attendance who came with great questions, concerns, and ideas. It was clear to me in that room that the proposed route north of the Fraser has support, and look forward to further consultation and study to move the process closer to realizing public transit in our area that has been talked about for decades. The Hatsick Watershed Stewardship Team continues to move forward with its work to develop solutions to address the challenges of flooding in the region, and I look forward to sharing our work to date with partners at this table and stakeholders in the coming weeks. And I'd like to wish everyone a very happy Family Day long weekend, and I encourage us all to spend time connecting with loved ones. As I learned in the last couple of weeks, life is very precious and can change quickly. So happy Family Day, everybody.
Good. Thank you, Director Castle. Director McElhonick.
Thank you. And we've had a lot of emergency situations. Usually I was talking to our fire chief, it's usually February is a little quiet. It has not been quiet. In the area just before Area E, where we have the large homeless encampments, I mean, it was almost a fire a week in that area. So there's been a lot of activity there. In the same area for this morning, there was a home invasion. So there's a lot of stuff going on right now in the area that is concerning. Good news, I've been working with the residents that have been impacted by the 2021 impact flooding, atmospheric river. And at the conference last week in Richmond, I was able to speak to that again, and we really want to keep that in the public eye. I had a really productive meeting yesterday with Sean Holman from UVic and Damian Gillis. So we're going to get the residents into the climate disaster project, and then we're going to be doing a separate journalistic campaign. And I think it's really going to empower them, and I'm really feeling heartened that we actually may be able to make some inroads and maybe make something happen on behalf of them. So that's what I've been busy with, and just really pleased with the evacuation report, and really happy with that. So thank you.
Good. Thank you, Director McElhonick. Director Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of things to report. I met with we call them the South Cultus leaders the other night, and they are the presidents or representatives from all the various stratas and associations that are at the south end of Cultus Lake. And it was just great to have a chance to meet everybody and to hear some of the concerns and some of the things that are working well in their areas, and a little bit of talk about working together. So that was a good night. Attended the EA forum last week along with several others here, and appreciated the time to spend together, but also Friday morning we talked about just some of the challenges facing regional districts as well as opportunities and things that are working well. So I just enjoyed having a chance to hear what others are thinking and to find out that we're all relatively similar in many, many ways. And that's about it for me. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Director Dixon. Director Wardenberg.
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick summary. I attended that trans meeting as well. It was very well attended by residents of Area C. Also, just a quick report, the Stehelis Primary Health Center is well on its way in the construction phase. I had a meeting with Tours and Harrison, one of the regular meetings. Happy to report the Airbnbs in Area C are increasing in number and the revenue from them. The Area C OCP mail out was done last week, and I encourage anybody who's listening, residents of Area C, to leave their comments on Have Your Say in regard to the Area C OCP. It's very important. And I did attend the forum. Yeah, learned a lot. It was good to see everybody there. Looking forward to the conference, the LGMA. I think that's it. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Wardenberg. Director Adamo.
Thanks very much. It has been an extremely busy time in Area B. A lot of things going on, but a couple of thank yous that are probably more important. We call upon our staff to do so many things on a regular basis, but we don't really acknowledge that they have to go out and beyond as well to pull off some things. So a special thanks to planning and bylaws. I'm sorry that I've been monopolizing your time over the last little while with some extraordinary and rapid involvements in our community, but thanks so much for reaching out and helping to answer my questions and to alleviate the concerns of many of our residents in the area. And we continue to work on that as well. But thanks so much for all those efforts in answering my crazy late night calls. And thanks to Modi. I've been developing a new relationship with Modi, who's been working on a lot of different areas in our region. And it's been a long time coming, and it's never happened in the past. So really appreciate their involvement in things. And again, happy Family Day. The Sunshine Valley Volunteer Fire Department will be hosting their annual music bingo on that weekend. It is kind of a contradiction. It's an adults only event on Family Day weekend, but the rest of the weekend is for the kids, but that night is for the adults, and it is a fundraiser for the Sunshine Valley Volunteer Fire Department. So thanks very much. And I look forward to my regular meetings with MLA Luck and Staff Sergeant in our region as we continue to work on areas that require major improvement throughout Area B. So thanks very much for everyone's efforts this past month.
Good. Thank you, Director Adamo. Director Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. One of our residents in North Bend lost everything in a house fire here just a few weeks ago. The community came together and held a luncheon to raise funds to help him out. He was very overwhelmed with the response and thankful. I too attended the Directors Forum, and I especially enjoyed the Friday session and discussing the shared issues with other regional districts throughout the province, pretty much the same as Director Dixon had mentioned. And then there's other ongoing things that are just kind of behind the scene, but keep me on my toes. Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Director Johnson. Director Davidson.
Thank you, Chair. So, yeah, just what can I say? Illegal fill continues. Not at the grand scale that was happening perhaps a year ago, but again, it just requires that continuous community monitoring because no regulatory agency seems to be able to get in the way of it. Other than that, sorry, that's it for me. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Director Davidson. I have nothing to report from Area D. Director Dixon's got something.
I have a question just because, we haven't quite been here long enough yet. One of the things that I wonder about in with the illegal fill, and I'm not going to get into any details, is a lot of it talks about punitive things. And so what I have been recently wondering about, here all the time is there's no place to take the material. And I just kind of wonder if, when we're thinking about this, if that's something we're thinking about, I guess, advocating to the province to find a spot for the material. I mean, it's not punitive. It's like, to me, that's solving a problem. So, that they keep saying there's nowhere to put it. So I just think find a place to put it. Anyway, that's it. Final thoughts.
Thank you, Director Dixon. Ms. Kinnaman.
Thank you. So moving down to public question period for items relevant to the agenda. We do not have any members of the public joining us in the boardroom, but we'll just turn things over to our Deputy Corporate Officer, Lauren Olenek, to check in online.
We no longer have any members of the public joining us online, and we have not received any written correspondence.
So looking for a motion to adjourn.
Motion, Director Dixon, second, Director O'Donnell. All those in favor, contrary, motion carries. Thank you.
Thank
staff.
you.
Thank you, directors.